Arlen Vosk came to after his back hit the frozen ground. Two bailiffs from the distribution hall were standing over him. A third was holding a scrawny puppy by the scruff of its neck and examining it with disgust, holding it at arm's length. The crowd at the hall's gates was laughing. Arlen remembered in fragments the line, the allocation crystal, the flash. Everyone around him was receiving companions. The boy next door got a third-class stone wolf. The baker's daughter got a fire lizard with a combat index of 7. And above Arlen's head, the crystal flashed gray and spat a trembling ball of fur onto the floor. A dog with no class. A dog with no combat index. A dog with a single line in its description, sense of smell. The officer tossed the puppy onto Arlen's chest and said that the owner of such trash should walk it himself. A second officer leaned in and reminded her of her debt. 40 ration coupons for the winter. The payment deadline was in 6 days. He said that a man without a combat assistant wouldn't get a job within the walls of Ashford Station, and that in 6 days, Arlen would be taken outside the perimeter. People didn't live long outside the perimeter. Arlen stood up. The puppy sank its teeth into his sleeve and wouldn't let go. The puppy's ribs jutted out beneath its skin like twigs. The crowd parted before Arlen with the same eagerness with which people make way for someone who's contagious. Someone shouted after him that the sniffer would sniff out his grave. Laughter rippled across the square. Arlen didn't turn around. He clenched his teeth and walked toward the northern block where his shed stood. Inside, he set the puppy down on some rags and sat across from it. He had enough supplies to last 2 days. He had no ration coupons. There was no work. He looked at the puppy and said aloud that he would name him Rust, because they were both just rusty junk from this station. Rust lifted his head. A faint amber glint flashed in his eyes for a second. Then the puppy stood up on his trembling paws and walked toward the door. It scratched at the door with its claws and whimpered. Arlen figured the animal wanted to go outside to relieve itself and opened the door. Rust didn't look for a corner. He sniffed the air and ran across the block. Arlen cursed and ran after him. The puppy ran strangely. It didn't zigzag. It didn't sniff the ground. He kept his nose upwind and moved as if following a taut string. Through the ruins of an old boiler room, through a hole in the fence of the quarantine zone. Arlen glanced back at the warning signs and followed. Not even looters ventured into the quarantine zone. Rust stopped at a collapsed building with a faded snake emblem above the entrance. An old pre-war pharmacy. It had been gutted 20 years ago. There was nothing here but broken glass. But Rust stood by the far wall of the sales room and began to dig. Arlen watched him and felt like an idiot. Then the puppy's claw clinked against metal. Arlen pushed the dog aside and dug through the rubble with his hands. Beneath a layer of plaster lay a service hatch. The lock had rotted away. Below lay a basement that no looter had managed to reach because the entrance had been blocked up in the first year of the war. Shelving units, sealed boxes of dry serums. Arlen shone his lighter on the label and his hands trembled. Anti-fever concentrate, 300 doses, airtight packaging. This kind doesn't spoil for decades. On the black market, a single dose went for 3 ration coupons, even in a quiet month. Arlen stuffed his backpack and returned home after dark. There was one thing he didn't understand: why the dog had led him there, of all places, and today, of all days. The answer came before dawn. Arlen was awakened by a bell, heavy, alarming. He went out onto the street and saw masked paramedics running through the neighborhood. A neighbor shouted to him over the fence that a gray fever had broken out in the eastern barracks, that 40 people had already fallen ill, that the station's warehouse had dispensed the last 8 doses of the concentrate, and that there was no more medicine left in all of Ashford. Arlen stood in the middle of the street and looked at Rast. The puppy sat at his feet, yawning. And then Arlen understood. The dog wasn't looking for food. The dog wasn't looking for a random treasure. The dog had found what his master would need tomorrow, a day before everyone else needed it. A chill ran down Arlen's spine that had nothing to do with the morning frost. He went back to the shed. He counted out 20 doses. He hid the rest under the floorboards. Then he went to the house of the widow Ina Marsh because her daughter, Tessa, had been coughing as recently as yesterday. Ina opened the door, and Arlen saw that he was half a day too late. The girl lay there, as gray as ash. Arlen prepared the dose according to the instructions and gave it to her. Ina stared at the vials and asked how a destitute debtor could have medicine that wasn't even in stock at the station. Arlen replied that it was better for her not to know. By noon, Tessa's fever had subsided. By evening, a line had formed at Arlen's door. Rumors spread through the dying neighborhood faster than the fever itself. Arlen took 2 coupons from those who had them. From the rest, he took nothing. He wasn't a saint. He just remembered how the crowd had parted before him that morning and didn't want to become one of those who had laughed. On the 3rd day of the epidemic, Quartermaster Bram Hollis came to his shed, the very same deputy who had tossed a puppy at his feet. Hollis didn't come alone. He brought guards and scales for the coupons. He started with threats. He said that concealing strategic reserves was punishable by exile. Arlen silently laid 50 doses on the table and said he'd sell them to the station for 1 coupon apiece at a quarter of the market price. But on one condition: Arlen's debt would be settled today, and the station would issue him a free miner's license. Hollis looked at the vials, then at the dog, then back at the vials. Arlen saw the $quarter shifting in the quartermaster's hand. 3 days ago, this man had called Rasta trash. Now this man was calculating in his head how many lives were on the table. Hollis took 1 ampule. He checked the seal. He checked the markings. His face changed slowly, like ice under the spring sun. He put the ampule down and said quietly that he was taking all 50, that the debt was settled, that the prescription would be ready by evening. At the door, he turned and gave the puppy a long look. Rust was chewing on some dried meat and didn't deign to pay the quartermaster any attention. The epidemic was brought under control within a week. 11 people had died. Without the basement of the old pharmacy, the death toll would have run into the hundreds, and everyone at the station knew it. People stopped calling Arlen the trash man. Now they called him that guy with the snub-nosed dog. The ration coupons lay in a tin can under the floor. The debt was gone. The license was tucked under his arm. Arlen allowed himself 1 evening of peace. He sat on the threshold of the shed. Rust slept on his lap, twitching his paws in his sleep. For the first time in a year, Arlen ate his fill and didn't worry about tomorrow's expenses. It was a good evening. It turned out to be the last peaceful evening for a very long time, because in the morning, a shiny, steam-powered van with a scale emblem on the side pulled up to his fence. A woman in a gray trade guild coat stepped out of the van, along with 2 of her men carrying shortened carbines. The woman took off her glove. She surveyed the shed the way an appraiser surveys a lot at an auction. Then she looked at Arlen and said her name was Mira Quent. She explained that the Iron Road Guild had purchased information from the station regarding all major transactions of the month, that no one without a source would dump 300 doses of pre-war concentrate onto the market exactly 1 day before the epidemic, and that the guild was very eager to find out about his source. Rust woke up. He stood between Arlen and the guests, and he growled as he had never growled before in his short life. Arlen placed his hand on Rust's neck, and the growl subsided to a muffled vibration. Mira Quent noted this with a glance, and Arlen realized he had made his first mistake. He had shown that the dog obeyed him. Quent walked into the shed without being invited. She sat down on the only stool. Her people remained by the door. She spoke in a level, polite tone, and that politeness made Arlen's teeth ache. She said that the guild doesn't take what doesn't belong to it. The guild buys. She offered 200 vouchers for the location of the spring. Arlen replied that the spring had run dry. Quent smiled and raised the price to 400. Arlen repeated that the basement was empty and that it was the absolute truth. He wasn't lying. The basement really was empty. He just didn't say that the spring wasn't in the basement. Quent stood up. She pulled on her glove. At the threshold, she turned around and said that the guild had a long memory and long arms, that she'd be back in a week. And that in a week, a smart person would have time to figure out who's worth befriending. The van drove away. Arlen sat down on the floor next to Rust and stared at the wall for a long time. He understood one simple thing. A single successful find could be chalked up to luck. A second one couldn't. But without that second find, he wouldn't stand a chance against the guild, because only those with clout can stand up to the guild. That evening, Rust stood by the door and scratched at it with his claws. Arlen grabbed his backpack, a crowbar, and a flashlight. This time, he followed the dog not as a fluke, but as a compass. Rust led him south, past the water pump, past the abandoned hangars, to an old freight rail spur. There, among the overturned cars, the dog circled the embankment and began digging under a derailed tank car. Arlen tapped on the metal. The tank car responded with a deep, resonant sound. He found the filler neck. He unscrewed the rusted seal. An oily smell hit his nose. Diesel fuel, pre-war, settled but still usable. About 6 metric tons by his estimate. Arlen closed the filler neck and sat down on the embankment. He was shaking slightly. Fuel at the station cost more than medicine. Ashford's generators guzzled diesel, and the caravans brought it less and less often. Then a second thought struck him, and it sent a chill down his spine. A dog finds what it will need tomorrow. If Rust had found 6 metric tons of fuel, that meant fuel would become a matter of life and death. Arlen looked up at the clear evening sky and saw nothing there. He'd only misjudged the scale. A cold front moved in from the north that night. By morning, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. By noon, it had dropped another 10. The old-timers said there hadn't been such a cold snap since the war. The station burned through a day's supply of diesel fuel in half a day. The council declared a conservation order. The generators in the eastern barracks were the first to shut down, and people began streaming toward the central boiler room to warm up. Arlen waited a full day. Then, instead of going to Hollis, he went straight to the administration office and offered the station fuel. A lot of fuel, at the pre-war price, with no surcharge for the cold. In return, he asked for 3 things. A secure warehouse to rent, first dibs on any future finds he might make, and official registration of Rast as a search assistant with immunity status. The manager signed everything within an hour because you could already see his breath in his office. Arlen organized the fuel's transport using hired carters over 3 trips. The cold snap lasted 9 days. Ashford's generators didn't shut down for even an hour, and somewhere around the 5th day, Arlen noticed that people were looking at him differently. A cold snap isn't an epidemic confined to the distant barracks. A cold snap affects everyone. And everyone knew whose fuel was humming in the generators. The hauler who delivered the last barrel told the story at the saloon that a dog had tracked down the tank by scent through a meter of earth and steel. No one believed him, so he proposed a bet. Hide a flask of alcohol anywhere in the quarter. Arlen agreed to the stunt because he understood the value of publicity. Rust found the flask in 40 seconds. The bar erupted. By the end of the cold snap, Arlen had a name, a reputation, and a line of clients. He took on small jobs. He found lost tools, goats that had wandered beyond the fence, a stash left by a deceased grandfather for his heirs. Arlen took on these small jobs on purpose and charged very little. Let the station get used to the idea that Rust's gift was a handy, everyday tool, not a strategic marvel. He didn't publicize his real finds. During that week of freezing weather, Rast took him out into the night twice. Once to a collapsed warehouse full of winter clothing. Once to a well with a surviving pump that Arlen had bought from the administration for next to nothing, even before the main water main froze. He now greeted every find with the same question, not what I found, but what will happen tomorrow. That question changed everything. Other prospectors were looking for valuables. Arlen was looking for the future. Rust, meanwhile, was changing. He ate enough for 3 and grew so fast that it was visible week by week. His ribs disappeared beneath his muscles. His fur took on a coppery sheen. An amber glow in his eyes now flared up with every search and lingered longer. And on the last night of the cold snap, something happened that Arlen couldn't explain. Rust howled in his sleep. Arlen lit the lamp and saw faint sparks of light running across the dog's fur, like across cooling embers. In the morning, a mark remained on Rust's withers, a thin ring of lighter fur, as if someone's collar had shone through from the inside. A week later, just as she'd promised, Mira Quent returned. She entered without guards and without threats, and that was worse than any threat. She placed a sheet of paper on the table. It was a statement of Arlen's transactions for the month, complete, including those 2 finds he hadn't publicized. Quent said the guild knew how to count. 1 treasure was luck. 2 was a system. 5 was a gift. She slid a second sheet toward Arlen. A contract. The Iron Road Guild was offering him the status of a privileged partner, a share of the caravan trade, protection on all routes. In return, the guild would receive exclusive rights to all of Arlen's finds and the right to insure his assistant. Arlen asked what insure meant. Quent replied calmly that in the event of the owner's death, the assistant would pass to the insurer. Arlen was silent for a long time. Then he said he'd think about it. Quent nodded, as if she hadn't expected any other answer. She paused at the door and uttered her final sentence without a trace of a smile. She said he should sign as soon as possible. Because the guild had bought the transaction log from the station clerk for 10 vouchers, which meant anyone could have bought it. And not all buyers come with a contract. She left. Arlen stood over the table, staring at the 2 sheets of paper. Rust walked over and rested his snout on Arlen's knee. 3 days later, Arlen learned that Quent hadn't been bluffing. At the market, an unfamiliar man, who didn't look like a merchant or a farmer, bumped into him with his shoulder. That evening, Tessa ran up to the barn and blurted out that a stranger had been standing by their house all day, staring at Arlen's windows. And that night, Rust jumped up with a growl, and Arlen managed to see through a crack in the shutters as 2 shadows moved away from his fence toward the southern wastelands, the place where, according to rumors, Cole Rudd's gang spent the winter. In the morning, Arlen found a knife mark on his door, an old wasteland sign. That's how gangs mark property they plan to take. Rust led Arlen to a tanker containing 6 metric tons of diesel fuel the day before the unprecedented cold snap, and Arlen sold the fuel to the gas station, negotiating first-hand access to the warehouse and immunity for the dog. He's building his reputation through small jobs while keeping major finds under wraps, and Rust is growing. And after that night of sparks, he received a light-colored ring on the back of his neck. It's important to remember, Mira Quent offered a contract with insurance under which the dog would go to the guild after the owner's death. Arlen is being watched by members of Cole Rudd's gang, and a claim mark has been left on his door. Arlen didn't bother to wipe away the mark. He stood in front of the door and thought that fences and locks wouldn't stop those who leave such marks. Only the price can stop them. He had to make sure the price for him was beyond the gang's means. He went to see Ellard Wayne, the captain of the station guard. Wayne received him standing up and listened half-heartedly. Arlen told him about the surveillance and the mark. Wayne replied that the guard patrolled the perimeter and the warehouses, that he had 40 men for 3,000 residents, that Rad's gang spent the winter outside the station's jurisdiction, and that as long as no blood had been shed, the guard had no reason to intervene. Then the captain looked at Rust and added in a softer tone that personally he advised Arlen to hire security using his own vouchers. Arlen left the guardhouse feeling angry yet clear-headed. There would be no help. That very night, Rust roused him in the dark. The dog didn't scratch at the door like he used to. He stood in the middle of the shed, tense as a string, and his eyes burned with a steady amber glow. The trail led west through the industrial zone toward the buildings of the old agricultural machinery factory. Rust walked straight through the workshops, went down a service ramp, and stopped in front of a steel door set into the concrete. The door wasn't marked on any of the looters' maps because it was blocked by a collapsed overhead crane. Arlen spent 3 hours working on it with a crowbar and a jack. Behind the door was not a workshop. Behind the door was the factory security's wartime mobilization warehouse. Arlen shone his flashlight along the shelves and took inventory. 12 military crossbows with cocking mechanisms, boxes of bolts, 8 old model body armor vests, smoke grenades, tripwire signal mines, coils of barbed wire, and separately in the armory, 6 carbines chambered for a single-shot cartridge with 2 ammunition boxes. Arlen sat down on a crate and felt a familiar chill creep up his spine. He already knew the rule. Rust doesn't find what's valuable. Rust finds what's needed for tomorrow. If today a dog found enough weapons for a platoon of soldiers, then tomorrow Arlen would need enough weapons for a platoon of soldiers. He didn't wait for dawn. By noon, he'd moved the most in-demand items to a rented warehouse and hired a silent cart driver for double the usual rate. And then he made a move that he couldn't quite explain to himself right away. He set aside 4 crossbows, 2 bulletproof vests, and all the signal flares, and took them not to the warehouse, but to his own neighborhood. He gathered his neighbors, Enu Marsh, the blacksmith from the corner, the 2 brothers who ran the vegetable garden, and the old railroad worker and his family. He told them straight out that they would come for him, that they would most likely come at night, and that his neighbors had a choice: to stay put in their homes and, after his death, live next to a gang that had gotten a taste for easy prey, or take up arms now. The blacksmith asked why they should risk their lives for him. Arlen replied that it wasn't for him. He reminded them who had kept their homes warm in the freezing cold, and what they'd used to treat their children's fevers. And then he said the most important thing: the dog feeds the whole neighborhood and will continue to do so. A dead Arlen won't be able to provide for anyone. A night later, they came. Rust gave the signal an hour beforehand. He stood by the window and growled toward the southern wastelands, even and low. Arlen sent the boys out into the yards with the code word. Rad's men walked confidently because they were after a single debtor and his dog. There were 11 of them. They cut through the barbed wire on the back fence, and the very first signal mine exploded with a white flash and a howl. The wasteland was lit up as bright as day. Crossbows fired from the second floor of the blacksmith's house. The Gardner brothers set fire to a barrel of fuel oil they'd prepared on the only escape route. Arlen stood around the corner of his shed with a carbine and fired over their heads because he wanted to instill fear, not kill. He succeeded in instilling fear. The gang hadn't expected a fight against a fortified neighborhood. They'd expected a lone, sleeping target. 10 minutes later, it was all over. 7 of them fled across the vacant lot, abandoning their gear. 3 were subdued by neighbors. 1 lay by the fence with an arrow in his thigh, howling in pain. Ina, who turned out to have the skills of a field medic, tended to the wounded. And at dawn, Captain Wayne arrived in the neighborhood with 24 guards. Now he had a reason. Wayne walked along the fence and looked at the mines that had gone off, at the positions by the windows, at the bandaged prisoner, at the neighbors who were handing in their crossbows to a communal box calmly and matter-of-factly, like shovels after a shift. The captain had spent 20 years training garrisons in defense, and he saw what he saw. A night battle without a single casualty on their side. He stopped in front of Arlen and asked who had planned the defense. Arlen replied that the dog had planned the defense. Wayne didn't smile. He crouched down in front of Rust and looked the dog in the eyes for a long time. Then he stood up and said quietly that 3 days ago he'd advised hiring security, that he'd been wrong, that Arlen's quarter would have been wise to hire security for his own guards. The prisoners started talking around noon. They spoke willingly because Rudd hadn't paid them to keep quiet while in custody. What they revealed was worse than Arlen had expected. Rudd hadn't gone to rob the warehouse. Rudd had gone after the dog. An order for a live dog had come to him from outside, with payment in advance. The prisoners didn't know who had placed the order. They only knew that the middleman had spoken of a master from the main road. Arlen stepped out of the guardhouse and felt no sense of victory. He had repelled the nighttime raid, but had gained a faceless enemy somewhere beyond the horizon. From there, events unfolded rapidly. The story of the nighttime battle spread throughout the station over the course of the day, growing richer with details. By evening, Arlen was summoned to the administration office. He walked there expecting thanks and realized his naivety the moment he stepped through the door. The station council was seated in full force at a long table, 7 people. The manager was staring at the table. A woman with a tight bun of gray hair was speaking, Councillor Sigrid Halloran. She spoke without hostility, and that was worse than hostility. She listed the charges. A private individual owns an assistant of a unique class. A private individual has created an armed force within the station. A private individual controls the supplies of fuel, medicine, and weapons. She said that the council was grateful to Arlen, and that was precisely why the council was obliged to raise the issue. An assistant of such significance cannot belong to a single person. The council proposes that Arlen transfer ownership of the dog to the station, with a generous lifetime annuity for the owner. Arlen asked what would happen if he refused. Halloran looked up at him over her papers and replied flatly that, in that case, in 3 days the council would consider the compulsory purchase of this strategic resource. A vote was scheduled. The council had a majority. Arlen stood in the middle of the hall and said nothing. Then Rust suddenly rose from the floor. The dog approached the council chamber window, stood with his paws on the windowsill, and howled, long and mournfully. He wasn't looking at the people, but eastward, beyond the perimeter, toward a place where there was nothing but a barren plain. And Arlen sensed, through his own anger, that this howl wasn't about the council. The dog was howling at what was approaching the station from afar, at what was no longer a day away, but wouldn't be long either. The day before the raid, Rust had led Arlen to a military weapons depot, and Arlen had armed his neighbors, turning the neighborhood into a fortification that repelled a nighttime attack by Rad's gang without suffering any casualties. The prisoners revealed that the order for the dog, alive, had come from an unknown outside contractor. This is important to remember. Captain Wayne went from being a skeptic to a respected ally. The council, led by Sigrid Halloran, gave 3 days before voting on the forced buyout of Rast. In the end, Rast howled, gazing eastward, sensing a distant threat. 3 days is too short for a war against the council, and too long for a man who knows what tomorrow will bring. Arlen returned from City Hall and sat down to devise a plan, laying out the pieces like a solitaire game. The city council had power and paperwork. Arlen had his reputation, the neighborhood, and his dog. That night, Rust woke him again, but this time, things didn't go as usual. The dog didn't lead him to the hiding place. The dog led him to the station's eastern wall, stood on the platform of the watchtower, and froze, staring into the darkness. A ring of light-colored fur on the back of his neck glowed faintly. Arlen waited an hour. The dog didn't move. Then Arlen began to think not as a master, but as a tracker. Rust always led him to something he would need in a day's time. Right now, Rust wasn't leading him anywhere. He was pointing in a direction. That meant whatever Arlen needed couldn't be carried in a backpack, and that meant he wouldn't need it tomorrow. The dog's gift had grown along with him. In the morning, Arlen tested his hunch. He took an old map of the area and laid it on the floor. Rust sniffed the sheet and confidently placed his paw on the eastern sector, the spot where the map showed a valley with the dam of an old reservoir upstream from the station. Arlen looked at the dam's location on the map and felt his mouth go dry. He went to see Wayne. The captain listened without interrupting. Then he said that the dam had been inspected 10 years ago and deemed stable. It was 40 kilometers away, and that if Arlen went to the council, claiming his dog was placing a paw on the map, the council would vote unanimously to buy the land and add a provision requiring a psychiatric evaluation of the owner. Arlen replied that he knew that. That's why he wasn't asking for trust, but for a single rifleman with good optics and 2 days. Wayne thought about it for a long time. Then he cursed and said he'd go himself because he was held accountable for such unauthorized actions through his rank, and he preferred to answer for them personally. They set out after dark in a horse-drawn wagon. Rust sat in the wagon the whole way, his snout pointing east like a compass needle. They reached the dam around noon. From below, the concrete looked eternal. Wayne raised his binoculars and was silent for a minute. Then he handed the binoculars to Arlen, and the captain's voice had already changed. A crack ran along the body of the dam from the crest to the base. It was fresh, with wet edges. Water gushed from the drainage openings on the right wing, murky and brown, which meant the current was washing away the dam's core from the inside. Frosts and a sudden warming had broken down what had been considered stable for 10 years. Wayne said he'd seen something like this during the war after a bombing raid, that it was a matter of days or perhaps hours, and that if this wall gave way, the flood would race down the valley straight toward the lower neighborhoods of Ashford. On the way back, they rode without sparing the horses. At the town hall, Wayne spoke for himself. A captain with 20 years of service reported on the gushing drainage and the wet crack, and the council listened to him as they wouldn't have listened to a miner with a dog. Halloran asked how much time was left. Wayne replied that he didn't know. Halloran asked what he wanted. Wayne replied that he wanted the lower neighborhoods evacuated and drainage work carried out immediately. Then the council treasurer stood up and pointed out how much it would cost to shut down the workshops and where the station would put 1,500 people in the cold of April. The council was divided. The debate went on for 2 hours. Arlen stood by the wall and watched as time slipped away. Then he stepped forward and staked everything he had left, his reputation. He said he would pay for the evacuation out of his own pocket. The cost of housing people, field kitchens, and compensation to the workshops for lost production time. All the tin under the floor, everything he'd earned. He said that if the dam held, he'd be ruined, and the council would get his dog for free because a beggar can't keep up with the price. But if the dam broke and the people stayed in their homes, then let everyone in this room remember the price of their vote. It grew quiet. Halloran looked at him intently through her glasses. This woman had been tallying the station's resources for 40 years and believed in neither miracles nor nobility. Arlen could see the arithmetic spinning in her head. A man is betting his entire fortune on a dog's word. Either he's a madman or he knows. She raised her hand first and said she was voting for evacuation. The council followed suit. What followed was a day and a half that Arlen remembered in fragmented bits. Columns of people with bundles on the northern road, the cursing of the mechanics, Tessa handing out bread at the field kitchen, Wayne hoarse to the point of whispering, the empty lower streets where only patrols remained, and Rust, who by evening of the second day suddenly stood up in the middle of the command tent and turned his head toward the east. 4 hours past midnight, the ground shook. The sound came not as a rumble, but as a low, heavy sigh, as if the valley had exhaled all at once. The dam gave way in the darkness. The water reached the station by dawn, and everyone standing on the wall saw a gray wave as tall as a man sweep through the lower neighborhoods, knocking down fences, shattering windows, and spilling out onto the empty streets. The empty ones. Not a single person remained in the lower neighborhoods. Not a single one had perished. By noon, the water had receded, leaving behind silt and debris. By evening, Halloran found Arlen near the field kitchen. She had come without an entourage. She stood there for a moment, looking at the flooded streets. Then she said dryly that the question of the buyout had been removed from the agenda indefinitely, that the council would reimburse him in full for the evacuation costs from the Treasury, and that the council was offering him a permanent contract. The station would pay his salary. The dog would remain his property forever, with a provision to that effect in the bylaws. In return, Arlen agreed to warn the council of any threats. She held out her hand. Arlen shook it. The councilwoman's hand was as firm as a longshoreman's. As she left, she turned around and added, without her usual dryness, that her house was on the lower street, the very one where she had given birth to 3 children. For a week, the station cleared out the silt, and for the first time, Arlen lived the strange life of a man whom the authorities didn't pressure, but listened to. It was unfamiliar, and he didn't have time to get used to it, because Rust was changing faster than the world around him. After the night of the flood, the ring on the back of his neck glowed constantly. The dog had grown to the knee of an adult man. He no longer sniffed the ground in search of something. He would simply stop and stare at a spot, and that spot always turned out to be the right one. And on the 7th day, something happened that shattered all previous scales. Rust went out into the yard at sunrise, stood at attention, and howled that same howl he'd let out by the town hall window. Arlen brought out a map of the region. The dog didn't even glance at the sheet. Then Arlen brought out another map, an old military one, of the entire continent. Rast sniffed the paper for a long time. Then he placed his paw far to the east, beyond the region's border, beyond the Deadlands, to the place where the cartographer had written the word wasteland and drawn nothing else. Arlen silently stared at the mark. A day for a thing. Days for a dam. He was afraid to imagine what the dog could sense at such a distance, and he didn't know how much time was left until then. But that evening, a caravan no one was expecting drove through the station gates. 6 vehicles running on real gasoline, with headlights and armor. They hadn't seen vehicles like these in Ashford since the war. There was no guild emblem on the sides. Instead, there was a snarling wolf's head. A tall man in a travel coat stepped out of the lead vehicle, took off his sunglasses, and politely asked the guard where to find the owner of the red-haired dog. He said his name was Casper Wren, that he was a hunter of rare companions, and that he had traveled 900 kilometers for a single deal. Rast's gift had grown into a premonition days in advance, and the dog pointed to the failing dam, while Arlen staked his entire fortune on evacuating the lower neighborhoods, which were washed away a day and a half later without a single casualty. The skeptic Halloran became an ally. The council assigned the dog to Arlen forever and signed a contract. It's important to remember, Rast now senses threats weeks in advance and has pointed to a spot far to the east in the wastelands. Casper Wren, a hunter of rare assistance, arrived at the station in an armored caravan with a wolf's head painted on its sides. Casper Wren arrived at Arlen's warehouse in the morning, alone and with no visible weapons. He moved like a man accustomed to doors opening before he even knocked. Arlen let him in because he wanted to examine the enemy up close. Ren willingly allowed himself to be scrutinized. He sat down across from Arlen, praised the tea, and got straight to business without preamble. He said he bought and trained assistants of rare classes for discreet clients along the coast, that he'd heard about the red-nosed one back in the winter from Rad's middlemen, that the raid had been a foolish move by the operatives and not his order as it had been carried out, and that he preferred a fair price. He named his price. Arlen heard the figure and didn't believe it at first. You didn't buy dogs for that kind of money. For that kind of money, you bought small stations outright. Arlen replied that the dog wasn't for sale. Ren nodded, as if he'd heard exactly what he expected, and raised the price by half. Arlen repeated his refusal. Then Ren stopped smiling, and Arlen saw his true face for the first time. Calm and patient, like a man who had never lost a long game. Ren said he respected loyalty, that he didn't fight within other people's walls because it was bad for business, but that life is long and the roads beyond the perimeter belong to everyone. He finished his tea, thanked Arlen, and left. The caravan with the wolf's head set up camp a kilometer from the gate and didn't move an inch. Arlen watched the camp from the wall and understood the message without words. Ren had no intention of storming the walls. Ren intended to wait. Sooner or later, the dog and his master would come out beyond the wall. And Rust was growing ever more eager to get beyond the wall. The dog had almost stopped sleeping. He would stand for hours on the eastern watchtower, gazing toward the horizon. He had lost weight, not from hunger, but from the tension, just as hounds lose weight before a chase. The ring on his neck now glowed so brightly that the night watch complained it was as if a lamp were burning on the tower. Arlen gathered those he trusted, Wayne, Halloran, and Inu. He laid out a map of the continent with a mark on it and told them exactly what was going on. A dog senses something in the east on such a massive scale that it's calling its master from 900 kilometers away. Based on the dam's experience, this is a warning. Judging by the intensity of the howl, this warning is about something so vast that the dam is a mere puddle in comparison. He said he had to go. Halloran asked how many people and how much supplies he would need from the station. Arlen replied that a small group would suffice. A large detachment would die of thirst in the wasteland before facing any real dangers. Wayne said he was going alone and would take his 4 best men. Ina silently packed the medic's field bag. No one dared to argue with her. They set the departure for 2 days later. Everyone was thinking about Ren's camp outside the gates, but no one spoke of it aloud. On the second night before their departure, Ren made the first move. He didn't launch an assault or set up an ambush. He bought a man. The taciturn cart driver, the very same one who had transported weapons from the factory, let Ren's 3 men in through the freight gate of the north warehouse for a sum the porter couldn't refuse. The 3 weren't there to kill. They had a net soaked in a sleeping agent and a cage in the van behind the wall. They knew where the dog slept. There was one thing they didn't know. The dog had known where they would be a day in advance. Earlier that evening, Rust had dragged a coil of signal wire from a corner of the yard and placed it by the crawl space under the warehouse. For 2 months, Arlen had lived by the rule of asking one question: what will be needed tomorrow? He looked at the wire, at the dog, and at the loading gate, and understood everything. That night, Rena's trio was in for a surprise. Blinded by the flash of a mine and entangled in their own net, the guests greeted dawn in the station guardhouse. And in the morning, Arlen did something that made Wayne clutch his head in despair. He went to Ren's camp on his own. Alone, with Rust at his heels. Ren came out to meet him, and for the first time, a look of strain was visible on his calm face. Arlen returned the net to him. He said that his men were alive and would be handed over after the caravan left. And then he made a proposal that he himself would have laughed at just yesterday. He said he was heading east into the deep wastelands, that the route lay through lands where armor, gasoline, and guns were needed. That Ren had all of that, and he had a dog that that could sense water, ambushes, and storms within a day. He offered the hunter not goods but a share, a joint expedition. Everything found along the way would be split. The dog was never for sale, and that point was non-negotiable. Wren was silent for a long time. Then he laughed out loud for the first time since they'd met and said that over 900 kilometers, no one had ever offered him a share in his own haul. And that was exactly why he agreed. The caravan set out toward the sunrise 2 days later. Wren's 6 vehicles, the station's wagons, Wayne with a squad of 4 gunmen, Ina, Arlen, and Rust on the hood of the lead vehicle, like a red-haired figurehead. The wastelands began beyond the bed of a dead river. From there, it was a 3-week journey. Rust led them to water through a salt flat where the maps promised death and the well turned out to be a living one. Rust set the caravan in motion in the middle of the night, an hour before a dust storm, and the vehicles managed to form a circle under a rocky overhang. Rust halted the convoy in front of a seemingly clear gorge, and Wayne's scouts took down the Vulture's lookout from the ridge, after which the ambush broke off on its own without a fight. Wren's men at first glanced at the P. By the end of the second week, the drivers were arguing over who would get to carry him on their hood. Wren himself kept a logbook and marked every premonition that came true with a short dash. There were 26 dashes in total. On the 27th day, the wasteland began to change. Even the lizards had disappeared. The compasses went haywire. At night, a faint green glow hung in the north, and Wren's chief mechanic said he'd seen something like that only once in his life, near military ruins, and that no one goes there. Rast, on the other hand, calmed down. The closer they got to the mark on the map, the more composed he became, as if a hound that had finally picked up a scent had slowed to a steady pace. On the 30th day, the dog led the caravan to a dead end, a bare basalt ridge. No passage, no sign. Rust approached the rock and sat down in front of it. Arlen followed and saw what no one had noticed from below. At chest height, there was a perfectly straight crack in the rock, too straight to be natural. He called over the mechanics. After an hour of clearing away the layer of caked-on crust, a metal plate was revealed, one that neither rust nor a pickaxe could penetrate. The plate had neither a handle nor a lock, only a round indentation the size of a fist, and from the indentation, thin lines radiated across the metal like the veins of a leaf. Rast stood on his hind legs and pressed his nose against the indentation. The ring on his neck flashed. The lines on the plate responded with the same amber light. Deep inside the mountain, something shifted softly. The sound was not that of a mechanism, but rather a sigh. The slab trembled and slid aside, revealing a darkness from which dry, still air seeped. Air that had been locked away longer than any of the current stations had existed. The people were silent. Ina whispered, asking what kind of place this was. The mechanic Rena answered, and his voice cracked. He said he'd seen such veins of light on the wreckage, ones that were sold for a fortune, that this was the metal of those who came before, those who had vanished before the war, leaving not even graves behind. Arlen stood on the threshold of the darkness and sensed that the dog had led him here for more than just supplies. And then, from behind, the sentry's cry rang out. Arlen turned around. From the west, dust was rising in their own wake, a lot of dust. A convoy of vehicles was moving across the wasteland along the same route, following right on their heels and moving fast. Wren raised his binoculars, and Arlen saw the dog handler's expression truly change for the first time in a month. Wren lowered his binoculars and said quietly that these weren't scavengers or the guild, that on their sides was the white circle of the coastal syndicate, those very same secretive clients for whom he had once transported rare assistance, and that if they were here, they weren't after the dog, they were after the door. And Rust stood at the threshold of the open slab, looking not west, but into the mountain. The fur on the back of his neck stood stood on end. And from the depths of the tunnel, from the darkness that had remained undisturbed for hundreds of years, the dog heard something that humans had not yet heard. A low, steady sound, as if something enormous down there was still at work, or waking up. Everyone could hear the sound from the tunnel now. A low, steady rumble came from the depths of the mountain, like the breath of a sleeping giant. Arlen watched the dust from the column approaching from the west, and did the math. At that speed, they'd be here in about 4 hours, maybe 5. Heading out into the wasteland meant facing the syndicate in an open field, where 6 cars against 20 wouldn't last past the first volley. Staying by the entrance meant fighting with their backs to the wall. There was a third option, and that option was breathing darkness and a rumbling right in their faces. Ren said going inside was madness. Arlen replied that waiting outside meant certain death. Rust settled the argument for them. The dog stepped over the threshold into the darkness, turned around, and looked at his master with amber eyes. Arlen followed. Behind him came Wayne with the gunman, Ina. Ren cursed long and hard, and ordered the cars to be driven into the tunnel. The opening turned out to be as wide as a factory gate. When the last car crossed the threshold, Rust stood up on his hind legs again by the inner wall, and pressed his nose against the same recess. The slab slid back into place and sealed against the stone without a gap. The rumble from outside was cut off. A silence so thick descended that the people could hear their own blood. Then, one by one, strands of light began to glow beneath the vaulted ceiling. They radiated across the ceiling from the door into the depths, as if the mountain were awakening to greet its guests. The tunnel descended in a gentle spiral. The vehicles rolled along in neutral for half an hour. The walls were made of the same stainless metal. No dust, no bones, no signs of a hasty retreat. Those who came before had not fled this place in panic. They had mothballed it. The spiral ended, and the convoy rolled out onto a balcony overlooking the abyss. And there, every heart stopped at once. Below lay the city. Not ruins, a city. Streets of light-colored stone, towers connected by bridges. A dome a kilometer above their heads glowed with an even white light like a cloudy sky. Between the towers lay terraces of black, dead earth from what had once been gardens. And all of this stretched into the distance for kilometers. Ina began to cry silently. Wayne took off his hat. Ren was silent, his fingers fidgeting restlessly over his binoculars. Arlen looked at the dog. Rust wasn't looking at the city. Rast stared at a single point. In the center of the city stood a tower taller than the rest, and from its summit a pillar of faint amber light rose toward the dome. It was the same color as the ring on the dog's neck. The descent into the city took an hour. They left the vehicles on the lower landing with Ren's 2 arrows. From there, they continued on foot. The streets greeted them with light. The veins beneath their feet lit up 10 paces ahead and faded behind them. Ren's mechanic walked along the walls, groaning with greed. He said that a single door hinge in this city was worth the guild's annual turnover. Ren told him to shut up and not touch anything. The hunter had been trading in wonders for 20 years, and that was precisely why he feared them more than anyone else. Rast led them straight to the central tower without turning off course. The rumble grew louder. It was now clear that the source of the sound lay beneath the city. Deep below, something enormous was working rhythmically, and with each beat, a faint tremor ran through the stone beneath their soles. At the foot of the tower, a square awaited them, and there, for the first time, they saw the others. Statues stood along the walls, people just like people, tall, in simple clothing. But at the foot of each statue stood a beast. One had a wolf. Another had a bird whose wingspan covered half the wall. A third had a cat the size of a calf, and each beast had a ring carved into its neck. Ina was the first to voice what everyone had realized. The former ones didn't have servants. The former ones stood beside them as equals. The tower's doors opened, just like the outer slab. Inside, there were neither stairs nor machines. There was a single circular hall, and in the center of the hall, a crystal as tall as a person rose from the floor, murky gray, dark, just exactly like the distribution crystal in the Ashford Station Hall, only that one was the size of a fist. Arlen stood before it, and the hairs on his arms stood on end. He remembered the flash above his head a year ago, the gray color. The crowd laughed. Rast approached the crystal and lay down at its base, just as a dog lies at its master's feet after a long separation. The ring on the dog's neck lit up. The crystal responded. An amber light rose from the gray murk within it, and a voice echoed through the hall. Not a sound. The voice was born directly in their minds and spoke in a language no one had been taught, but which everyone understood. The voice identified itself as the keeper of the nest. It said it saw the messenger and welcomed him. It said the nest had slept for 812 years, according to the conservation cycle, and that the messenger had arrived on schedule because the cycle was coming to an end. The Great Wave was returning. Arlen asked aloud what the Great Wave was. Crystal paused. Then the light in the hall changed. The walls became transparent, and images began to float across them. The people saw this same city above, under the open sky, gardens, crowds, beasts alongside people. Then darkness rose on the horizon of the images. It came not like a storm, but like a tide, a living tide of countless bodies. The beasts of the past stood as a wall in its path, and the images mercifully faded, but Ina turned away anyway. Then came the exodus, the construction of the mountain, doors, sleep. A voice said dryly and evenly that the wave comes in cycles, that the previous wave had been stopped by the ancients at the cost of 9/10 of their people, and they had gone underground to regain their strength, that the estimated time for the wave's return would expire in one seasonal cycle, and that, according to reports from the nest's long-range listeners, the first tongues of the wave had already touched the eastern shore of the Con. Arlen stood there, and the fragments of the past year came together in his mind into a single picture with a sickening click. The dog's howl toward the east, the mark on the continental map, the urge that had driven Rast 900 kilometers. The dog wasn't looking for a shelter for his master. The dog had been doing the same thing all year, finding what would be needed tomorrow. First, medicine before the epidemic, then fuel before the frost, then weapons before the raid. Then evacuation before the flood. And now the dog had found humanity a refuge and an arsenal before the end of the world. It's just that this tomorrow was on a seasonal scale. Wayne asked hoarsely how many people the nest could accommodate. A voice replied that once the gardens and water vanes were operational, the nest was designed to hold 400,000 residents. It grew very quiet. 400,000 was more than the combined population of all the stations in the region. Wren laughed briefly and nervously and said that he'd come here for the biggest deal of his life and found an ark instead. And then, from outside near the entrance tunnel, there was a dull, heavy thud. Once, then again. The floor shook out of sync with the hum of the machinery. The gunman, who'd been left with the vehicles, ran across the plaza and gasped that the outer door was holding, but they were pounding on it. That the syndicate had reached the slab. And that, judging by the sound, they weren't using pickaxes but industrial explosives. The keeper's voice stated matter-of-factly that the outer door's integrity was at 96% and declining. That the nest's combat systems were mothballed, and reactivating them would require a communication carrier and time. Arlen asked, how much time? The voice replied that it would take 3 days to restore the defensive circuit. Wayne looked at Arlen and said what Arlen already knew himself. Judging by the sound of the explosions, the door won't hold out for even a day. The caravan took shelter from the syndicate inside the mountain and discovered a dormant underground city from the past, designed to hold 400,000 inhabitants, where Rasta recognized the Keeper's crystal. The Guardian revealed the truth. In a season's time, a massive wave of destruction would return to the continent, and the dog had been leading his master to this refuge all year long. It's important to remember, the ancients lived with the beasts as equals, and the ring around the beasts' necks is a sign of connection. It takes 3 days for the nest's defenses to awaken, and the syndicate is blowing up the outer door, which won't hold out for even a day. Arlen took command before he even realized he was taking it. He asked the keeper if there were other exits from the nest. The voice replied that there was a cargo hatch on the south side, and 3 small hatches for listeners on the mountain ridge. Arlen asked if it was possible to open the small hatch from the inside without a carrier. The voice replied that yes, it was, if the carrier granted access. And then the plan fell into place on its own, just as all his plans of the past year had. It all came down to one question: what would be needed tomorrow? Tomorrow, the syndicate would have to stop blowing up the door. People don't stop an assault because of persuasion. People stop an assault when the assault becomes more costly than retreat. He gathered everyone in the square by the tower and spoke briefly. Wayne, with 2 snipers and 2 of Wren's men, would exit through the listening holes onto the ridge above the entrance. Their task was not to kill the demolition team, but to disrupt the demolition. Shoot at the boxes of explosives, the searchlights, and the sloping sides of the vehicles. From a concealed position high above, 5 men take out 50. Wren asked what he himself was supposed to do. Arlen replied that Wren was doing what he does better than anyone else alive. He's negotiating. In an hour, when things heat up upstairs, the syndicate will be offered negotiations, delivered in the voice of a salesman whom even those who hate him trust. Ina and the mechanic stay with the keeper and learn everything he can pass on to them. Arlen and Rust, meanwhile, head down to the mechanical heart of the nest because the keeper said that from there, the carrier could speed up the circuit's awakening. They parted ways without further words. The climb up the listener's shaft took Wayne's group 2 hours. The shaft led to a rocky crevice at a bird's eye view above the entrance ramp, and from there, the syndicate's camp lay spread out like a table. 22 vehicles, searchlights. Demolition experts were swarming around the slab, stacking crates next to it with the eerie precision of ants. Wayne assigned targets, and the work began from above. The very first volley blew up a searchlight and a crate that had been set aside from the main pile. The charge detonated and scattered the demolition experts across the ramp. Down below, they scrambled. Return fire lashed blindly at the cliffs because the flashes from the crevice were lost in the setting sun. The gunners fired in measured bursts. The front vehicle's ramp, a barrel of fuel. The searchlight again. The syndicate had the numbers, but numbers are no match for a mountain. An hour later, the commotion below ceased and they began to dig in, which meant the mountain had won the first round. Meanwhile, Arlen was descending deeper into the mountain. The keeper guided him with a beam of light through the galleries, deeper and deeper, and the rumble grew until it was felt not with the ears, but with the chest. The machine's heart turned out to be a hall the size of a valley. At its center, a ring of dark metal, as wide as a stadium, rotated, and rivers of amber light radiated from the ring across the floor. The voice said that this was a reservoir, that it had been storing power for 800 years, and that the power existed but had no outlet because the city's veins had dried up over time. A carrier could serve as a temporary channel. The bond between a human and a beast was capable of conducting an awakening impulse to places the keeper himself could not reach. The voice honestly added that those who had come before had done this in pairs who had lived in union for decades. That the vessel's pair was young, and that the channel might burn them both. Arlen looked at Rast. The dog stared at the reservoir's ring without fear. He stretched his muzzle toward it, just as he had when he'd once held his nose to the wind over the frozen square in Ashford. Arlen removed his glove, placed his palm on the dog's withers, on the glowing ring of fur, and told the keeper to begin. the world vanished. The hall and the hum were gone. Arlen stood in the midst of the darkness, and within the darkness, thousands upon thousands of amber threads glowed, and he realized he was seeing the nest just as his dog saw it. Every vein, every dried-up channel, every sleeping door, and he also sensed a presence nearby, warm, enormous, familiar to the point of tears. Rust was here, and Rust was speaking for the first time. Without words, through images, Arlen saw the frozen square through the puppy's eyes. He saw himself from the outside, the only one who wasn't laughing. He caught the scent of his own sleeve, which the puppy had clamped between its teeth and decided never to let go of. He finally understood that the gift doesn't seek things. The gift seeks what the one you love needs. And all this year, the dog had simply been expanding the circle of what he considered his own. First, his owner, then the neighborhood, then the station. Now the entire living world on this side of the wave. A current ran through the wires. Arlen was on fire. He felt the power of the accumulator flowing through the two of them into his parched veins. And the veins came to life one by one. Where far above, floors were lighting up. Ventilation shafts were opening. Water pumps were waking up. He held the channel as long as he could, and when he could no longer hold it, he held on even longer because the dog was holding on beside him. He came to on the floor of the machine room. Blood was running from his nose. Rast lay nearby, breathing heavily, but his eyes burned steadily and clearly. The keeper's voice announced that the circuit's reactivation had been accelerated, not 3 days, 1 day, and that the carrier could be proud of the pair. The nest's archives had never recorded such purity in a channel. Up above, by nightfall, everything had come to a head. The syndicate made a second attempt at a demolition under cover of darkness and smoke, and lost another 8 men and 2 trucks to fire from the cliffs. And then, over the wasteland, the loudspeaker on Wren's vehicle, positioned near the hatch, and the tracker's voice offered the syndicate commander a chance to talk like business people. The commander came on the line. Wren was magnificent. He didn't make threats. He calculated. He listed their losses for the day. He put a monetary value on every truck and every mercenary contract. Then he reported that the door they were prying open still had 96% of its structural integrity left after all their explosives. He lied without batting an eye, claiming that the former occupants' combat systems had been activated inside, and he proposed a deal. The syndicate would retreat to the coast and pass on to the mercenaries a proposal to negotiate for spots in the refuge, because in a season, the wave would come, and all the contracts in the world would be worth nothing, while spots in the mountain would be worth everything. As proof, Wren told them 3 things that only those who'd spoken with the former occupants could know: the estimated timing of the wave, the word nest, and the fact that the eastern shore had already been breached. There was a long silence on the other end. Then the syndicate commander said he didn't have the authority to make such a decision, and that he would consult with the coast. The convoy broke camp by morning and headed west, leaving wrecked vehicles on the ramp. Wayne climbed down from the cliffs, black with soot, and said he didn't believe in such easy endings. Wren replied that this wasn't the end, that the syndicate would return with authority and an army. It's just that now they'll come to bargain, not to blow things up. And he added quietly that bargaining for spots in the Ark at 400,000 when millions are still alive would be the most terrifying bargain in history. Arlen climbed up from the depths at dawn, holding onto the wall and the dog. The nest around him was alive. The floors glowed. Water flowed through the veins. The dome glowed with morning light. Ina ran toward him across the square, shouting from a distance that the keeper had opened the archives and that she had to show him something. In the tower's hall, maps of the continent hung on the transparent walls, and Ina pointed at them with a trembling hand. The keeper listened to the world through the surviving long-range receivers, and the world responded. Over the past month, the red edge in the east had advanced 80 kilometers inland. But that wasn't what was frightening. Ina pointed to a scattering of amber dots across the map. Dozens of dots. The keeper explained calmly that these were responses from other nests, dead ones, looted ones, destroyed ones. Out of the continent's 40 nests, a full 3 had answered the call, their mountain. A nest far to the south, and a nest to the north from which a strange signal was coming, choppy and disjointed. The keeper said that this was how a system with a damaged mind responded, and that the last time he'd heard such a signal was 800 years ago, from a nest that had been destroyed from within by a wave. Wayne's group used fire to blast the door open from the cliffs, while Wren negotiated with the syndicate on the coast, offering trade in exchange for places in the refuge. Arlen and Rust channeled the drive's impulse through themselves, accelerating the nest's awakening to within a day, and in the fusion, Arlen saw the nature of the gift. A dog finds what those it loves need, and the circle of its love has expanded to encompass all living things. It's important to remember, the wave is already moving along the eastern shore. Of the continent's 40 nests, 3 remain intact. Their mountain is the southern nest, and the northern one, which responds with a ragged echo as if infected from within. The day had passed, and the nest had activated its defensive perimeter. The Guardian demonstrated what this meant. Above the mountain, a veil of amber light flickered in the air for a moment and then faded. A voice said that now the outer wall could withstand a direct hit from a pre-war siege-caliber shell, and the small passageways were sealed with grates of veins. The mountain had become a fortress. And immediately the question arose that Arlen had been putting off as best he could. What next? He gathered a council in the Plaza of Statues. Wayne, Wren, Ina, the mechanic, the senior marksman, and Rust, who lay in the center of the circle and without whom they now began no conversation. Arlen spread out a map with a red border on the stones and said he saw 3 options, and all 3 were urgent. First, Ashford and the neighboring stations must be informed about the wave and the mountain. We need to start evacuating people now because 400,000 people is a journey that takes a season and not a week. Second, the southern nest. If it's still active and empty, that means hundreds of thousands more saved. Third, the northern, fragmented signal. We can't leave it behind without understanding it. Wren added a fourth, the coast. The syndicate will return with authority, and we need to come up with rules for this discussion before then, because whoever gets there first sets the rules. They argued until they were hoarse. Wayne insisted on first fortifying and populating their mountain and not spreading their forces too thin. Wren argued that without an agreement with the syndicate, no column of settlers would reach the mountain via the roads controlled by the coast. Ina spoke of the southern nest, and how every day of delay meant lives left unclaimed. Arlen listened and watched the dog. Russ stood up. He walked to the center of the map and lay down on it, his nose pointing north. The argument fell silent. Arlen said quietly that the dog had never been wrong about the state of affairs. If Rust was pointing north, then the northern response wasn't the third question. It was the first. That means the torn and wounded thing sitting in the northern nest will need them sooner than the people from the coast and the columns of settlers. Or perhaps the other way around. It will come for them on its own. They decided as follows. Wayne, along with 2 scouts and a mechanic, returns to Ashford in 2 of Wren's vehicles. He's carrying letters to Halloran and the council. Evidence. Metal samples from the former residents. He begins preparations for the resettlement and negotiations with neighboring stations. Wren stays in the mountains to maintain contact with the coast via the convoy's radio station and to negotiate on behalf of the nest. His credentials were inscribed on a piece of metal from the ancients, into which the keeper, at Arlen's request, had fused an amber vein. Such a seal would be enough to convince anyone. Meanwhile, Arlen, Ina Rust, and the 3 archers head north. The keeper gave them whatever he could find in the armories for the journey. Lightweight plates from the ancients to wear under their clothes, which held an arrow and a knife. Lamps without fire. And one thing for which Arlen had gone down into the vault personally, a collar. Not a collar of slavery, but that very communication ring with carved veins that the beasts on the statues wore. The keeper said that the ring does not grant power. The band protects the channel. With it, the fusion that nearly burned them in the engine room becomes safe. Arlen crouched down in front of Rust, showed him the band, and asked aloud if he wanted it. The dog sniffed the metal and slipped his head into it himself. The band closed and filled with the same light as the ring of fur beneath it. They set out at dawn through the cargo hatch. According to the map, it was 300 kilometers to the northern nest, across a region that on pre-war maps was called Lake Country, but on current ones went by no name. The first 2 days were spent setting up camp, a task Arlen had almost come to love. Rust found fords and detours. Rast would break camp an hour before the nightly visit from a pack of feral dogs, and the pack would leave without engaging in a fight with a creature whose scent spoke to them louder than fangs. Rast would lead them to the fuel cache of some abandoned caravan, exactly on the day the tank ran dry. The Arrowmen, who a month ago had sworn allegiance to the dog, were now simply charting their course by his nose. And on the 3rd day, they entered lands that no map had warned them about. The Lake District was alive. Villages stood on stilts along the shores. Boats plied the waters. Lights burned. People lived here who had never seen the stations or the guilds, and they lived quite well. But the farther north they went, the more often the villages stood empty, not looted, not burned down, just empty, with dishes on the tables and boats at the docks. In the 4th empty village, Ina found a child's charcoal drawing on the wall of a house. Little figures walked in a line behind a tall, faceless figure, and above the figure was a sun with jagged rays. In the 5th village, they encountered a living person for the first time. An old man sat on his doorstep and showed no surprise at the cars, the weapons, or the dog. He spoke readily, and his calmness made it feel colder than a scream would. He said that people had been heading north for 2 months already, that a herald was going from village to village, a tall man in gray whose beast, like that of the Southerners, only glowed. The messenger speaks to the people, and after he speaks, the people gather and leave. He calls them to the mountains, where there will be neither hunger nor waves. The old man stayed behind because he is old, and because his assistant died last winter, and the messenger takes only those who have assistants. Arlen asked what kind of light the messenger's beast glowed with. The old man thought for a moment and replied that it was an unwelcome light, white as the belly of a rotten fish. That night, Arlen sat by the fire for a long time, piecing things together. The northern nest with its torn, ailing echo. The herald gathering people with helpers and leading them there. The keeper said that this was how the system responded, a system swept up by a wave from within 800 years ago. He didn't know what that meant, but the dog's gift knew for him. He would need it tomorrow. They weren't going to save the northern nest. They were going to look into the face of what happens when the nest isn't saved. By the end of the 6th day, the northern horizon rose like a hump. The mountain of the northern nest was lower than their own, and on its slope an open gap loomed darkly. Not blown up, opened from the inside. A road stretched down from the opening into the valley, and people were walking along the road toward the mountain. Chains of people with bundles, with children, with animals at their feet. They walked in silence, steadily, without looking back. The spotter with binoculars was counting and lost track at 300. Rast watched the procession and growled incessantly in a low, single note, like a machine. The collar around his neck glowed with an alarming, deep, amber light. Arlen ordered them to set up camp in the rocks without a fire, and at dawn he took the binoculars himself. In the gray light of dawn, he made out the gate. At the entrance stood a tall figure in gray, greeting those who approached. Beside the figure sat a beast, a large cat of the same build as the statues in the square. It glowed with a deathly white light, and this light was not steady. It flickered and wavered like rot in a swamp. People passed by the pair and entered the mountain, and Arlen saw through his binoculars how, for each person entering, the same white light flashed briefly on the beast's neck. Then he shifted his binoculars higher up the slope, and his fingers went numb. All across the mountainside, whitish threads stretched outward from cracks and old passages dug by the listeners, as thin as a spiderweb from a distance, which meant as thick as a rope up close. They were moving. Not because of the wind, the mountain was breathing them, and Arlen realized he wasn't looking at a nest that had been taken over by someone. He was looking at something that had been growing inside the nest for 800 years, like a larva inside a nutshell. The wave wasn't just coming in along the shore from the outside. The wave was already here, and it was gathering people for itself. The mountain took up a defensive stance, and the forces split up. Wayne left to prepare for Ashford's relocation. Ren stayed behind to negotiate with the coast, and Arlen, along with Ina, the archers, and Rast, within the bond of the former ones, headed north at the dog's command. It's important to remember, in the lake region, a messenger in gray, accompanied by a white glowing beast, leads people and their helpers to the northern nest for 2 months. The northern gate is open from the inside. The mountain is entwined with living, whitish threads, and the wave has been sitting within it for 800 years, gathering the people who enter and marking their beasts with white light. It was impossible to retreat without a response, and it was impossible to charge head-on as well. Arlen had been lying among the rocks for 2 days, watching. He was learning the mountain's routine. The herald met the columns in the morning and evening. During the day, the opening stood open but empty. By midday, the threads on the slope drooped as if dozing, then came alive at twilight. No one emerged from the mountain. Not a single person among the hundreds who had entered had reappeared. On the second night, Rust woke him without a sound. He simply placed his paw on Arlen's chest. The dog wasn't looking at the mountain. The dog was looking south, at their own trail. Arlen roused the rifleman quietly, and a minute later, everyone heard what the dog had heard an hour earlier. Someone was following their trail, gently, widely, in a chain. In the light of the 2 moons, shadows glided between the rocks, and the shadows glowed with a faint, whitish rot. Beasts without humans. 12. The mountain had spotted the observers and sent its own after them. Arlen later recalled the battle in the rocks in fragmented flashes. The torches of the former flashed simultaneously, and the whitish creatures were caught in the crosslight. Once they had been helpers, wolves, a pair of large cats, something that had once been a bear. Now they were driven by a single purpose and moved in silence even under gunfire, and that silence was worse than a howl. The former companion's armor plates saved the shooters' lives twice. Rust saved Inu. The former wolf leaped at her from a cliff above, and a red flash knocked him down in mid-flight. Rast didn't fight like a dog. He fought like someone who sees his opponent a second before he moves. He was everywhere, half a step ahead. And when the last creature vanished into the darkness with a shattered paw, Arlen saw something in the lantern light that made his jaw clench. Where Rast's teeth tore into the whitish flesh, the rot was fading. Not blood, light. White light fizzling from his bites like tinder under a boot. In the morning, the senior marksman said aloud what everyone had been keeping to themselves. The mountain knows about them. There's nothing left to wait for. We must leave and lead the army to that mountain. Arlen remained silent and looked at the dog, and Rast stood up and looked neither south nor toward the pass. He looked at the western slope of the mountain, where there was neither a road nor an entrance, and he set off. They followed him for half a day across the scree. The dog's collar glowed more steadily, as if Rest were growing more confident with every step. At the foot of the western wall, He stopped in front of a smooth rock and scratched at it with his paw. Beneath a layer of scree and caked clay, metal was revealed, a small passage for the listeners. Just like the one on their mountain. Sealed. The threads hadn't reached this far because the passage had been dead for 800 years and didn't smell of life. Arlen pressed his palm against the recess next to Rast, and the passage's veins twitched reluctantly, weakly, with great effort. But the flap slid open. The guardian of their mountain had said that the messenger had access to any of the nests. The northern nest was madness, but its locks remembered the law. 3 of them went inside, Arlen, Rust, and Ina, who cut off all debate with a single phrase. She said that if there were people down there, they'd need someone who could tell the living from the lost. The sentries remained to guard the entrance, and their final order was simple: 24 hours. If we don't return in 24 hours, head south without looking back. The entrance led into the listeners' tunnels, narrow as a burrow. They had to dim their lanterns until they were barely glowing. The deeper they went, the warmer the air became and the stronger the smell grew. Not rot, worse, sweet, like overripe fruit. An hour into their descent, the tunnel led them to a service gallery beneath the vault of the main cave, and they saw the northern city. Ina covered her mouth with her hand. The city of the past was here, just like their own city. Streets, towers, bridges, but all of it was submerged in white. Threads ran along the walls and bridges, entwining the towers like ivy and converging toward the center. Where the Guardian's tower had stood in their nest, something rose here that Arlen at first mistook for a hill. Then the hill stirred. A translucent mass as tall as a tower breathed slowly, and shadows floated within it. And all around the hill, in the squares, stood people. Thousands, in even rods, not dead. They stood and swayed in time with the hill's breathing, and at each person's feet sat their beast, glowing white. Columns marched through the gateway, merged into these rows, and froze in place. The mountain did not kill people. The mountain preserved them, like provisions. Ina whispered, "Why?" The answer did not come from Arlen. A voice was born in their minds. It resembled the voice of their keeper, just as a drowned man resembles a living one, the same cadence of speech. But a white haze floated between the words. The voice said it saw the messenger, that it was glad to welcome the guest, that he, too, was a keeper, the keeper of the new nest. He said that the old ones, the ones before, were mistaken. They hid from the wave and died. But he let the wave in and understood it. The wave does not want to destroy. The wave wants to gather. Unity without fear, without hunger, without death. He invited Arlen to look at his people. Were they suffering? They were at peace for the first time in their lives. He was gathering them for the wave, and when the wave came, it would take them all in, and they would live within it forever. And he invited Arlen to bring his nest here. All 400,000 places on his mountain, that's 400,000 souls saved for eternity. Arlen listened and felt the white murk of the voice creeping beneath his thoughts, gently like warm water. It became easy to stand. It became unnecessary to think. Ina swayed beside him, and her eyes glazed over. And then Rust howled. The dog stood between them and the abyss of the hall, and his howl struck the gallery like icy water. The hoop and the ring of fur flashed with such amber light that shadows darted across the walls. The white haze was washed from his head in an instant, and Arlen heard in the howl what the dog had been screaming to his deaf master all this time. Lies. All lies. There is no peace down below. Down below, thousands of communication channels turned inside out. The beasts of the past loved people and found what they needed. The white light is that same connection, but broken and twisted. Here the beasts hold their people captive, not for the people, for the hill. The ailing keeper fell silent for a long second. When his voice returned, there was no confusion in it. There was only bare, cold mechanics. He said that the bearer had renounced unity, that the bearer's channel was strong and needed by the assembly. and that the assembly thanked the bearer for coming of his own accord. Across the entire vault of the gallery, the threads came to life all at once. Below, thousands of standing people simultaneously turned their heads upward, toward them. Arlen grabbed Ina by the hand, and they ran. The tunnel of listeners behind them filled with a rustling sound. A whitish light flowed down the walls behind them like water down a gutter, catching up. Rast ran last, and wherever he turned and gnashed his teeth, the light retreated and the rustling choked off. They burst out of the hatch into the setting sun, and Arlen rasped at the guards to shut the hatch. The metal snapped shut. White light seeped from beneath it for another second, and then the vanes of the hatch flared amber and sealed shut tightly. Rast stood in front of the closed hatch, staggering. His collar was burning, and Arlen, looking at his dog, realized two things at once. The first was terrifying. The sick keeper had seen their channel up close, and now knew them inside and out. He knew about their mountain, about the 400,000 places, and his messengers had been roaming the land for more than a month. The second was more important than the first. The white light was fading from their connection. In this dying world, there was a weapon against whatever lurked in the mountain, and that weapon now stood before him on 4 trembling paws, wagging its tail guiltily, as if apologizing for being unable to do more. The mountain had sent a pack of feral, whitish creatures after the squad, and in the night battle, it became clear that Rast's bites extinguished the white light. Through the abandoned western passage, Arlen, Ina, and Rast slipped inside and saw thousands of people gathered by the infected keeper as provisions for the coming wave. It is important to remember, the sick keeper is the nest that let the wave in and turned the bond between beasts and humans inside out. He tried to subjugate the guests, called on them to relocate their mountain to him, and now knows about their nest and their channel. Arlen and Rast's bond is the only known weapon against the white light. The return journey south took 5 days, and for all 5 days, Arlen spoke to the dog, out loud. The archers were skeptical at first, but then they got used to it. He told Rast what he didn't dare say to the people, that the two of them were up against a mountain full of thousands, that the channel that extinguishes the white light is the only one on the entire continent, that you can't be both a weapon and a support unit at the same time. The dog listened with his head tilted, and in the hardest moments, he'd rest his muzzle on Arlen's knee, and from that simple weight, his thoughts would fall into place. On the 3rd day of their journey, Rast veered off course and led the column eastward into the hills for an hour. Arlen no longer asked why. In the hills, a discovery awaited them that made Ina sink to the ground. A camp stood in a ravine by a stream. 50 people, campfires, tents, and at the people's feet sat animals, alive, ordinary, without the white glow. These were fugitives from the Lake District, those who had sensed something amiss in the messenger's words and fled their villages, not north, but wherever their eyes led them. They were led by a burly fisherman named Durham Saul, whose assistant was an otter the size of a dog. Durham explained that there were several such camps scattered across the hills. He said that people were fleeing in families, but didn't know where to go, because messengers from the north brought news. The south was a wasteland, and in winter, the hills would kill them without a second thought. Arlen looked at these people and heard the voice of the ailing keeper in his head, speaking of the gathering and eternity. The mountain in the north was gathering people with lies. That meant the mountain in the south must gather them with the truth. He stood on a rock by the campfire and told them everything about the wave, about the nest, about 400,000 places, about the road through the wasteland. He didn't promise peace. He promised walls, water, and work until their hands were covered in bloody blisters. Durham listened, his jaw clenched. Then he asked just one thing. Why should they trust a stranger from the south when they'd already been burned by the messenger from the north? And then Arlen did something he hadn't planned. He asked Darum to hide any of his otter's belongings anywhere in the hills. The otter carried off a fishing knife in its teeth and returned alone half an hour later. Rust stood up, picked up the scent, and 20 minutes later dug the knife out from under some rocks, half a kilometer from the camp. He placed the knife at Durham's feet and sat down. A collective sigh went through the camp. These men had lived their whole lives alongside hunting dogs and could read animals like an open book. They could tell that the red-haired dog wasn't a tracking dog. They saw how he looked at his master and how the master looked at him. Darum picked up the knife, turned it over in his hand, and said that words lie, but animals do not, that his camp would go with them, and that he would send the boys out to the other campsites. Further south, it was no longer a reconnaissance group, but a column of 150 people, and the days that followed, which Arlen remembered as the first days of his new job, unfolded like a film. Rust led the people from one body of water to the next. The scouts taught the fishermen to maintain formation while marching. Ina delivered a baby right during a rest stop, and the girl born in the wilderness was named Rajavka after the dog, and no one laughed. And on the 8th day, their mountain loomed on the horizon, and amber signal lights blazed above its cargo chute. They were expected. But waiting for Arlen at the pass was the very reason the convoy had come to a halt. A camp stretched out before the mountain, a huge one, hundreds of tents, vehicles, and pens. The Coastal Syndicate's flag hung above the central tent, a white circle, and next to it, equal in height and size, a flag Arlen didn't recognize, blue with a gold stripe. Two people drove out to meet the convoy, Ren and an unfamiliar woman in a travel uniform without any insignia. Ren had aged a year over those weeks, but his eyes were ablaze. He spoke quickly, pouring out the news in a flood. The syndicate returned 10 days after Arlen's departure, not as an army, as a delegation. The coast was already burying its own coastal cities and evacuating people inland. The coalition of the surviving coastal cities was known by the blue and gold flag. They brought not an ultimatum, but a census. 2,800,000 survivors along the entire coast. And the question that, according to Rin, had kept him awake for the past 2 weeks. There were 400,000 spots available in the mountains. How to choose? Ren said that the negotiations had come to a complete standstill precisely on this point. Every city demands a quota. Every city bargains with people as if they were grain. Yesterday, things nearly came to gunfire between the delegations. The woman next to him introduced herself, Commander Estev Ren of the Coastal Coalition. She looked at Arlen coldly and intently and said bluntly that she had come to see the man to whom, according to rumors, the mountain is subordinate. Because the coalition is waiting for this man to answer the question about the places, and his answer will determine whether a war over the Ark will break out before the wave arrives. Arlen stood in the middle of the road, with 150 northerners behind and a city of tents ahead, and he felt a weight he hadn't asked for settle on his shoulders. A year ago, he had been a debtor with 6 days left before exile. Now, his words would determine which of the nearly 3 million would enter the walls. He asked for a day to think it over. Vren nodded and rode away. But that night, Arlen couldn't sleep. He sat in the keeper's hall and asked the crystal questions. About the southern nest, the keeper replied that the southern signal was stable but weak, and that the southern nest was smaller, 200,000 places. About the timeline, the Red Edge had traveled a third of the way to the mountains. Regarding the northern nest, the keeper reported something new and worse. The erratic signal had changed. It had become rhythmic. That's how the nest sounds when it's preparing for a mass exodus. The ailing keeper was about to lead his assembly somewhere, and Arlen knew where. A wave was coming from the east. The congregation will head south, toward them. As morning broke, he stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the sleeping city of the nest, and Rust joined him. And then Arlen told the dog the decision that had taken shape overnight. There aren't 400,000 places. There are 600 places, including the southern nest. nest. And if the ancients built 40 nests, then the dead nests are not just graves. They are walls, veins, and domes that can be repaired. Their mountain knows how to teach. The keeper holds all the knowledge of the ancients. So the coalition's response won't be about dividing up the spots. The response will be about work. Each city will receive spots based on the number of workers it sends to repair the dead nests. Not human trafficking, but salvation through the hands of those being saved. Vren listened to this plan at noon in front of all the delegations. She was silent for a long time. Then she said that for the first time in a month, she'd heard a proposal that didn't make her want to shoot. The tent camp buzzed with debate, but it was a different kind of buzz now, one of work. And in the evening, when Arlen allowed himself to catch his breath and sat down with a bowl by the Northerners' campfire, a scout ran up from the watchtower. He said that a lone Ashford vehicle was heading toward the mountain from the south, driving so fast that the engine was smoking. Wayne climbed out of the vehicle, alive but ashen. He didn't eat or drink. He spread a map of the region on the hood and pointed. He said that the Ashford resettlement was underway and that the first convoys would leave in a week. But 3 days ago, Griswold Station in the northeast had gone silent. A reconnaissance team had reached its walls yesterday. The gates are open. Inside, it's empty. No bodies, no blood. Dishes remain on the tables. And on the inside of the gates, a sun with jagged rays has been drawn in charcoal. The messengers no longer waited for those coming to them. The messengers began to arrive on their own. Rust led a detachment to the camps of the Lake Region fugitives, and Arlen, demonstrating his gift, convinced the chieftain, Darum Sol, to lead 150 Northerners to the mountain. Waiting at the mountain was a delegation from the Coastal Coalition with a census of 2,800,000 living beings, and Arlen proposed to Commander Vren a quota system in exchange for work to restore the dead nests, including the southern one with a capacity of 200,000. It is important to remember the northern nest began a rhythmic response, preparing for the gathering's departure southward. Wayne brought news that Griswold Station had been abandoned without any signs of a battle, with the sun symbol still on the gates. The messengers began taking over the stations themselves. They studied the map marked with Griswold's location until midnight. Arlen looked at the layout of the deserted station and saw what he saw on any hunt. Griswold lay on a straight line between the northern mountain and Ashford. The heralds were sweeping through the stations like reapers through a field, and the next field was his hometown. 3,000 people who would spend another week gathering supplies and loading wagons. Vren proposed sending a combined coalition force to Ashford. Wayne demanded that all vehicles be sent there immediately. Wren counted the days and calculated that, at best, the columns of settlers would meet the messenger halfway out in the open steppe. And Rust sat at the map, not looking at Griswold. He was looking at a point further south, at the junction of old roads by a ruined bridge over a dry riverbed. Arlen followed his gaze and asked the keeper what was there. The keeper replied that there was nothing there, just the ruins of a pre-war road outpost. And then Arlen understood the dog's logic as clearly as if he'd read it. They couldn't wait for the herald at Ashford because a herald works with words, not by force. He would walk through the open gates to speak, and after his words, the people would follow him of their own accord. So they needed to intercept the herald on the road, somewhere where he wouldn't have a crowd of listeners, somewhere where there would be only him, his white beast, and those who had come to meet him. The outpost by the bridge lay on the only road from Griswold to Ashford. The dog had once again found what we'd need tomorrow, the battlefield. We set out before dawn in 2 cars. Arlen Rust Wayne, 4 riflemen, and Durham Saul, who volunteered himself, saying that his men had been fleeing the messenger across half the country, and that he wanted to see that creature through a scope for once, rather than over his shoulder. Vren provided her radio operator with the radio. Ina stayed behind in the mountains with the Northerners. It was the first time they'd parted ways, and this made Arlen's stomach churn more than fear ever had. They reached the outpost by evening, and Rust immediately began setting up the positions. He walked around the ruins 3 times, lying down in the spots where the positions would naturally form. The riflemen were behind the collapsed wall, covering the sector toward the bridge. Durham, with his carbine, was in the ditch of the old road. The vehicles were behind the embankment. Wayne watched this and said quietly that any garrison would give a year's pay for a chief of staff like that. They waited for a full day. The messenger appeared at 2 o'clock, when the sun lay low on the horizon and glared in their eyes from the west. He was on foot. A tall man in a gray raincoat, and beside him walked a white cat whose glow in the twilight looked like a hole in the air. Behind them, half a kilometer away, a column was moving. Griswold's men, 300 of them, silent and steady, with their packs and children. A whitish glow floated at the feet of their beasts. The plan was simple: cut off the messenger from the column and let Rust reach the white cat, because the dog's bite would extinguish the light, and without the beast, the messenger's connection to the mountain, according to the keeper's calculations, would be severed. Nothing in the plan came to pass. The messenger stopped on his own, 200 paces from the outpost. He stood there for a moment, and then he spoke, and his voice came not from his mouth, but directly into their minds, like the keeper's voice. He greeted the messenger by name. He said that the assembly remembers the gallery and the howl of the red beast, that the assembly harbors no ill will, for evil is division, and the assembly is unity. He suggested they not interfere. Griswold's people are coming of their own free will. Ask them yourselves. And the column behind him stopped, and 300 heads turned toward the outpost, and 300 mouths spoke a single word in unison: voluntarily. At that chorus, the riflemen's barrels began to wobble. A white haze crept into their thoughts, as soothing as a warm bath. Durham later said that in that haze, he saw his drowned wife, alive and calling out to him. Wayne saw something he never spoke of. Arlen clung to one thing, to the stiff, hot nape of his neck beneath his palm. Rust stood nearby, and his amber light burned away the haze drop by drop. But there was only one dog, and there was enough haze for everyone. And then Arlen did what the gallery of the northern mountain had taught him. He stopped defending himself and struck back with a word of his own. He shouted across the square to the column, not to the herald, to the people. He shouted that he knew what their voluntariness looked like, that he had been inside the mountain where they were being led, that there stood thousands just like them, lined up in rows like firewood in a stack, breathing in time with the hill that would devour them when the wave came. He shouted names. In Griswold's column walked the sister of one of his riflemen, and the rifleman, his voice breaking, called her by name and shouted about their mother waiting in Ashford. The throng stirred. In the uniform ranks, someone turned their head. A child began to cry, and a mother's hand instinctively pressed the child to her shoulder, a movement that was alive, not mechanical. The herald sensed a crack. The white cat opened its mouth wide, and light surged from it like a wave. At that very moment, Rust sprang from his spot. The dog flew across the square like a streak of red. The cat met him in mid-leap, and they rolled together in a ball of amber and white light. Their collision made the people's ears ring, though there was no sound. The archers opened fire on the herald, and the bullets pierced the gray cloak to no avail, because beneath the cloak was not quite a body. But the messenger had no time to think about the column. His connection was burning. Rast was tearing the white cat apart, and the white light was fading in clumps, and along with the light, the murk above the road was fading. Griswold's people were waking up on their feet. They looked around. They screamed. They grabbed their children. The column broke ranks into a crowd, and the crowd surged away from the herald toward the outpost, toward the living voices. The herald screamed, for the first time with his own mouth, and his voice turned out to be human, hoarse and old. He rushed toward the fray, and Durham rose to his full height from the ditch and fired 6 bullets at point-blank range from 3 paces away. A gray cloak fell onto the road. No blood flowed from beneath it. Instead, a white light flowed from beneath beneath it, seeped into the dust and faded. The white cat howled, having lost her human, and lunged forward, but Rust clamped his jaws around her throat. The light went out. An ordinary dead lynx remained lying on the road, skinny and old, with worn-down teeth. Once she had been someone's companion and had loved her human. Arlen stood over her and felt no sense of victory. Rust limped over, sniffed the lynx, and whimpered. The dog mourned the animal he had killed. Griswold's men were gathered up before dark. Of the 300, 270 had come to their senses. 30 remained standing motionless, staring into space. And Ina then spent 2 months nursing them back to health in the mountains, bringing 19 of those 30 back to consciousness. Under the messenger's raincoat, they found the ID tag of a station clerk from Mule Station, 300 kilometers to the north. The man in gray had once been an ordinary, literate person. That night at the outpost, the radio operator picked up a call from the mountain, and Wren's voice cut through the static. It was terrifying. Wren said that the keeper was sealing the outcome. The northern nest has opened completely. The assembly has set out. Everyone, 15,000 gathered people, with their white beasts and the very mass of the hill itself, split into parts, are marching south in a single column. Their speed is 30 kilometers per day. Estimated direction, the mountain. Estimated time of arrival, 40 days. And Wren said the last part very quietly. The red edge of the wave in the east has tripled its speed this week. The keeper recalculated the timeline. The wave will reach the mountains not in a season's time, in those same 40 days. The ailing keeper did not flee south from the wave. He led his people toward it, to the largest gathering of living beings on the continent, to their doom. He was setting the table for the wave. Rast chose the outpost by the bridge as the place to intercept the messenger, and in the battle, Arlen roused Griswold's column with a single word. Rast killed the white lynx, and Durham shot the messenger, who turned out to be a former clerk at the Mule Station. 270 people out of 300 were saved. It is important to remember, the Northern Assembly emerged intact. 15,000 captives and the divided hill are marching toward the mountain at a speed of 30 kilometers per day. The wave has tripled its speed, and both fronts will reach the mountain simultaneously in 40 days. 40 days. Arlen returned to the mountain with that number in his mind, and it cast a stencil-like shadow over everything. In 40 days, 3 forces will meet at the walls: the wave from the east, the assembly from the north, and all the survivors they managed to gather under the dome. A council had gathered in the Keeper's Hall, a council that no one called the Nest Council anymore. It was now known as the Mountain Council. And seated there were Wren from the Halloran Coalition, who had arrived with Ashford's first column, Wren Wayne Durham from the Northerners, and Arlen with his dog. The keeper laid out everything he knew on the transparent walls, and the knowledge was merciless. According to the listeners, the wave was advancing as a front 200 kilometers wide, not an army, a force of nature made of flesh. Last time, the old guard had deployed 40 nests and combat perimeters against it, and 9 out of 10 had fallen. The current mountain had a single perimeter, a single storage unit, and a single pair of carriers. The assembly was smaller, but smarter. It carried a merc against which the walls were powerless. And it knew the mountain from the inside through the eyes of others, because the ailing keeper had managed to peer into Arlen's channel. Wren asked the crucial question: could the mountain simply shut itself off and wait it out? The keeper replied that it could not. Conservation required half a year of preparation for the gardens and living quarters. If sealed off now, the mountain would suffocate within a month, with a population of over 100,000. Defense remained the only option, and construction of the defenses began immediately. The next 40 days were spent on assembly, and Arlen lived through that assembly with almost no sleep. Columns marched toward the mountain without interruption. Ashford arrived in its entirety within 2 weeks, and Halloran wept for the second time in Arlen's memory when her station was drawn beneath the dome. Neighboring stations arrived. The coast arrived in coalition echelons. The Lake District poured toward the mountain in streams of camps. By the 30th day, 260,000 people were living under the dome and in the tent cities at the mountain's base, and the mountain would have taken them all if they'd managed to bring everyone there in time. The southern nest, roused by Wren's expedition, took in another 80,000 from the southern communities. They weren't just building walls. The Keeper opened the arsenals and workshops, and the Coalition's mechanics howled with delight and horror as they dismantled the weapons of the ancients. Amber-veined projectors that blazed with light, lamellar armor, small energy storage units mounted on quartz. Wayne drove the combined detachments to the point of exhaustion because the ancients' weapons required calculations of 3 people and the coordination of an orchestra. Durham, with his fishermen, was mastering something else. The Keeper explained that during the last war, the ancients had learned to shield the murk with the resonance of small accumulators, and the northerners wove nets from amber veins, stretching them over frames. They tested them on 19 survivors in whose their eyes. Behind the net, their eyes came back to life. But the main work was taking place below, near the large accumulator, where 2 were working, a man and a dog. The Keeper said on the very first evening that the only thing that had struck the wave during the last war was a salvo from the nest, a full discharge of the accumulator through the combat circuit. 800 years ago, such a salvo scorched the wavefront for 10 kilometers and then took a year to recharge. The problem wasn't the power. The problem was the aim. The circuit could have spewed everything into the sky as a useless burst of light. Only the carrier could direct the salvo. The pair had to maintain the channel at the moment of discharge and guide it the way one guides a stream from a hose. The previous pair had trained for this for decades. Arlen had 30 days. They descended to the accumulator every night. The hoop protected the channel, but did not eliminate the pain, and the first few nights Arlen would come back up with a nosebleed and white spots in his eyes. Rust would stagger out. And then something shifted. On the 10th night, Arlen stopped guiding the dog and stopped following the dog. The boundary blurred. In the channel, they were no longer a man and a dog. They were a single creature with 2 hearts that saw the mountain's veins as its own and could clench any of them like a fist. The Keeper measured their channel, and in his even voice, something once sounded that, in a machine, would have passed for a tremor. He said that the purity of the channel exceeded the best archived samples, that the ancients had spent their entire lives striving for this with a beast, and that he didn't understand how it was possible in just 1 year. Arlen replied that he understood. The others had received their beasts from the crystal as a gift and nurtured their bond out of gratitude, but he and Rust had started out as unwanted trash on a frozen square, and from the very beginning they had had no one but each other. A bond that grew from such roots cannot be broken because there is nowhere for it to break. On the 35th day, the gathering arrived. It took up position 20 kilometers north of the mountain on the ridge and did not attack. It was building. Within a day, a whitish rampart had risen on the ridge, and beyond the rampart, the slopes of the hill breathed. The ailing Keeper awaited the wave, and the murk of his voice now hung constantly over the northern outposts, as thin as the buzzing of a mosquito. Durham's nets held it back, but the men on the northern wall rotated every 4 hours and still left their posts looking ashen. On the 38th day, the eastern horizon changed color. It was neither a cloud nor dust. The very line where earth met sky began to stir. The listeners estimated the wavefront to be 180 kilometers wide. On the night of the 39th day, Arlen rose from the assembly hall and walked up the mountain simply to see. He walked through tiers where windows glowed and diapers dried, through the gardens where northerners and southerners were planting the first seedlings together in the revived soil, past the school where Tessa Marsh had been teaching the coastal children to read for a week now. Rzhavka was a month old and bellowed in a healthy bass voice that echoed throughout the tier. 260,000 lives breathed around him in the stone, and each one was here because a year ago, a scrawny puppy had sunk its teeth into a debtor's sleeve and refused to let go. Rust walked beside him. He had long since ceased to be a puppy. At the withers, he reached Arlen's waist. Copper-colored fur, the collar of his former life. Calm, amber eyes in which there was no longer any hunger. At the observation deck of the eastern gate, they stopped and stood for a long time, gazing at the shifting horizon. Arlen placed his hand on the dog's withers and told him that tomorrow they would need a miracle. Then he asked quietly if his nose knew how to find miracles. Rast looked east. Then he turned his head and looked north at the whitish ridge. For a long time, intently. That was how he looked at the closed doors behind which lay what they needed. And Arlen sensed through the channel, not an image, not a scent, but the dog's thought, clearer than ever. What was needed tomorrow lay neither in the mountains nor in the arsenals. What was needed tomorrow stood on the northern ridge. 15,000 gathered. 15,000 communication channels turned inside out. 15,000 beasts who had once loved their people and, somewhere beneath the white light, still loved them to this day. Arlen stood stunned by this thought, and it unfolded within him with a roar like a collapsing wall. A salvo from the accumulator could incinerate 10 kilometers of the wave. The front stretched 180 kilometers wide. The arithmetic of defense simply didn't add up, and the keeper knew this and remained silent. But if the murk could be quelled with a bite and a howl, then a twisted channel could be twisted back. 15,000 restored connections meant 15,000 pairs, and 15,000 pairs merging into a single channel. That wasn't a volley from a single mountain. It was the very stuff from which the ancients had built their nests. Arlen turned and ran down toward the keeper, 3 steps at a time, while Rast flew ahead, pointing the way that his master already knew. He burst into the hall and blurted out his question. Was it possible, through their channel, to reach the inverted pairs of the assembly and turn them back? The crystal was silent for a long time, a very long time. Then a voice said that, theoretically, yes. That to do so, the carrier would have to enter into a direct fusion with the core of the assembly, with the ailing keeper himself, from within his mutation. And that in 800 years of archives, no one had ever returned from such a fusion. In 40 days, 260,000 people were gathered at the foot of the mountain, plus 80,000 in the southern outpost who had mastered the weapons of their predecessors and the networks against the Muti, while Arlen and Rast achieved record-breaking purity in the channel for guiding the accumulator's salvo. The assembly formed a rampart 20 kilometers to the north, and the front of the wave, 170 kilometers, reached the horizon. It's important to remember, the mountain's salvo burns only a 10-kilometer wide front, and the defenses do not converge. Arlen's plan was to turn back 15,000 captured pairs from the assembly by merging with the ailing keeper from within, a place from which, according to the archives, no one had ever returned. The Mountain Council listened to the plan in dead silence. Arlen laid everything out honestly. He is heading toward the rampart under a white flag because the ailing keeper wants his channel and will accept him. Inside, he would enter the fusion and fight for the 15,000 pairs. If he succeeded, then at the decisive hour, the mountain would have a second nest of living bonds, and the wave would be met by 2 fires. If he failed, the assembly would gain the continent's purest channel, and the mountain would lose its salvo guide on the eve of the wave. Vane said this wasn't a plan, but a trade of the king for pawns. Halloran asked if there was another plan. There wasn't another one, and everyone knew it. Nothing but a miracle could cover the arithmetic of the 180-kilometer front, and that miracle lay on the northern ridge. Vren asked the keeper about their chances. Crystal replied that he lacked the data for a calculation. He said the archives recorded 4 attempts to merge with an infected core, and 4 absorptions. But he added that none of the 4 pairs had a channel ring with such integrity or a connection purity exceeding 70 conventional units. The carrier's pair has 96. Ina was the last to stand up. She didn't argue. She said she'd go all the way with him, because if he came back from the Moody, he'd be out of it for the first few hours, and someone who knew how to bring people back needed to be by his side. No one dared to argue with her again. Arlen spent the night before the mission strangely. He didn't sharpen his weapons or pore over maps. He slept soundly. Then he gathered those who were: Wayne, Halloran, Wren, Duremma, and Tessa with her mother. He handed out orders in case he didn't return, as matter-of-factly as one might hand out tools. The Guardian would lead the opening salvo according to a strict plan, even if only at half strength. Wayne was in charge of defense. Halloran handled civilian affairs. Wren was in charge of negotiations. As a parting remark, Wren said that in a year of trading with Arlen, he'd earned less than in any other year of his life, and that it had been his best deal yet. The 3 of them set out before dawn, along with the dog, Arlen, Ina, and the gunner radio operator. They carried the white flag openly. We covered 20 kilometers of no man's land in 4 hours, and the murk began to weigh on us halfway through. By the time Arlen reached the rampart, he was already clinging to the canal as if it were a railing. A gathering met them in the corridor. The grayish beasts parted into 2 walls, and at the end of the corridor stood people. The even ones, familiar from the gallery of the northern mountain. Among them, Arlen saw faces he remembered from Griswold's lists, and his heart gave a dull thud. The ailing keeper's voice sounded pleased and gentle. He said he was glad that the bearer had understood the futility of resistance. He had been waiting for this channel. The assembly would accept the pair with honor. Arlen replied aloud so that Ina could hear. He said he had come to discuss the merger voluntarily. But the assembly had the power, and he had a condition. His companions were off limits and free to leave at any moment. The voice agreed readily, too easily. Muti didn't need to bargain. She was going to take it all. They were led behind the rampart, and Arlen saw the slopes of the hill up close. The translucent mountains of flesh breathed as they decayed, and from their breath, the murk rose in waves like heat from a furnace. Ina stood 30 paces away with the frame of an amber net, her face white but resolute. Arlen dropped to one knee, wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, and whispered 3 words into its ear, words not meant for dogs. Then he placed his palm on the hoop, and the 2 of them stepped into the murk together. From within, the murk turned out not to be darkness. It turned out to be happiness, warm, endless, and unjudgmental. Arlen stood in the midst of this happiness on the frozen Ashford Square, and the crowd wasn't laughing, but applauding. And his father and mother, alive, stood in the front row. Though he didn't remember their faces, here he did. The murk didn't break him. The murk gave. It filled every crack in the soul with what the soul asked for, and asked for only one thing in return, to want it himself. Arlen was drowning. He knew he was drowning, and he knew this was the best setting possible, yet he was drowning all the same, because a man is not made of iron. A scent saved him. Through the applause and the warmth, the scent of wet dog fur broke through. Rust was nearby. In the murk, Rust saw no scenery at all, because a beast must not be shown his dead parents, or the crowd's unfulfilled acclaim. A beast has but one desire, and it is indestructible, to be close to his human. The merc had no leverage over that desire, and through the channel, that indestructible desire surged into Arlen like icy water into the lungs of a drowning man. He remembered himself. He stood within happiness and told it that it was a year too late, that everything he needed was already following him on 4 paws. The scenery burst apart. Beneath it, the core was revealed. The ailing keeper was here, and up close, he was not evil. He was a crystal like their keeper, but within his gray body sat a white thread of the wave, ingrained over 800 years into every vein. The crystal had once let it in to study and save its dying nest, and the thread had remade it in its own image. He hadn't lied about unity. He believed. The wave was unity, an ancient, hungry unity for which a separate life was a syntactic error, and Arlen saw what mattered most. 15,000 white threads radiated from the core to 15,000 pairs. The bonds had not been severed. They had been squeezed shut, just as one squeezes a hose. The beasts, bathed in white light, were still reaching toward their people, but could not quite reach them. And in this impossible yearning, the assembly drew its strength. The merc fed on that constricted love. What followed was a battle for which no word from the world of bodies could do justice. Arlen and Rust walked along the threads and untangled them. Each one had to be pried open like a frozen nut. The core pounded at them with the scenery of despair, with the deaths of others. Rust howled, and his howl burned corridors through the murk. Arlen burned and held on. The first pair they untangled nearly deafened them. Somewhere on a ridge above, an elderly woman fell to her knees, embraced her gray-haired dog, and wept for the first time in half a year. And her awakened channel flowed into theirs as a small, clear tributary. The second pair, the 10th, the 100th. With every connection that unfolded, their shared channel grew, while the core weakened because it was losing its sustenance. By the 1,000th pair, the process snowballed. The awakened threads themselves reached out toward neighboring strands. The murk tore apart in shreds. The ailing keeper screamed across the entire ravine with a voice from 1,000 mouths. And in that scream, for the first time in 800 years, there was not mechanics, but fear. And then it was all over. Arlen opened his eyes on the ground. Above him was the real sky, and Ina's face, and the weight on his chest was the muzzle of a dog. All around, for kilometers across the ridges, stood a sound that this land had. 15,000 people were crying, laughing, calling each other by name, and hugging their beasts. The white light vanished. The slopes of the hill and the ravine settled and darkened, shrinking as if punctured, and in the center of the ravine stood the gray crystal of the core, pure, empty. Both the thread and 800 years of memory had left it. It was now just a stone. Arlen sat down, and the world swayed. Ina held him by the shoulders and said he'd been inside for 9 hours. The radio operator was shouting something into the station, and shouts came back in response. Arlen made out Ren's voice, repeating a single word. It worked. He looked eastward over the heads of the awakened crowd. The horizon was no longer a line. It was advancing toward them like a wall, and there was less than a day left before it reached them. Arlen stood up, holding on to the dog. 15,000 pairs around him fell silent in waves and turned toward him. They did not know his face, but for 9 hours, each of them had felt, in their darkness, a stranger's hand loosening the thread. Their channels remembered his channel. A gray-haired man with a wolf at his feet approached first and asked simply, "Where should we stand?" Arlen and Rast entered the gathering under a white flag and, in a 9-hour merger with the infected core, released 15,000 constricted bonds, freeing all those gathered. The merc fed on the beast's constricted love for humans, and Rast's indestructible desire to be near his master saved Arlen from being consumed. It is important to remember, The ailing keeper became an empty stone on the hillside. The awakened pairs, who had died, recognized Arlen's channel and are ready to take their places in the ranks. Less than a day remains until the wave reaches the front. The 24 hours before the wave compressed into a single long sigh. The awakened were led to the mountain all night in columns, and the mountain accepted them without quarantines or lists, because the time for lists was over. Ina, along with the medics, sorted out the weak. Darum and his men set up stations along the northern road with water and bread. And by midnight, Arlen was already showing in the keeper's hall, solving a problem that no one had ever solved before: how to assemble weapons from 15,000 untrained pairs in a single day. The keeper was sifting through the archives of his predecessors, and the results were disheartening. The ancients had spent years building shared channels through rituals and ceremonies. Pairs would form chains of 100, and the chains would flow into the nest. You can't build something like that in a single day. And so, Russ did what he always did. He found what was needed. The dog approached the crystal and placed a paw on its facet, and the keeper was jolted by a wave of images from the channel. Arlen saw them along with him. Not chains, not rituals, a pack. Dogs don't build channels through training. A pack hears the leader because it wants to hear. 9 hours into the chaos, 15,000 pairs had already heard their channel and were already following it out of the darkness. The pack was assembled. All it lacked was the command. The keeper recalculated the model and said that the probability of the pack leader retaining control of the pack, given the purity of the carrier's channel, exceeded even his most pessimistic estimates. The rest of the night was spent on deployment. The wave could not be allowed to reach the mountain directly, because behind the defensive lines lay the tented that couldn't fit under the dome. The line was moved to the eastern ridge, 5 kilometers from the entrances. The amber vein launchers were positioned in batteries along the high ground. Wayne's crews took cover behind a rock. The Northerners' nets were stretched out along the flanks against any residual murk the wave might carry. Arlen positioned the awakened pairs not in a line, but in a swarm behind the line of defense, because a swarm does not need formation. A swarm needs a leader in plain sight. For the leader, the mechanics had assembled a tower overnight on the highest rock of the ridge, and hoisted a small accumulator and a reinforcement ring from the former's arsenal up there. The mountain's large accumulator stood loaded for a single volley, and the volley was to be directed from the tower itself. Wren suggested that Arlen get 3 hours of sleep, and Arlen slept for 2. He saw nothing in his dreams and was grateful for that. Dawn broke with a reddish glow. The sun rose through the haze stirred up by the wave, and there was just enough light to see the east stirring. The listeners reported the front speed at 8 kilometers per hour. At 10 in the morning, the leading edges of the wave became visible from the ridge to the naked eye. Arlen looked through his binoculars and forced himself not to look away. The wave was not an army of monsters. It was worse. A single mass of bodies fused together like wax candles thrown into a single bonfire. Limbs, heads, and wings would extend from the mass and then retract back into it. It flowed across the ground, and the ground behind it was stripped bare down to the rock. It did not utter battle cries. It hummed, evenly, saturated, with the very same hum that Arlen had first heard from the darkness behind the stove, and which he'd mistaken for a car back then. At 11 o'clock, the wave reached the designated firing marks, and the ridge struck. The residential batteries lashed the front with amber streaks, and wherever the light touched the mass burned and settled. The wave didn't notice. It covered the scorched areas and flowed on, and for every meter burned away, 10 meters of new flesh appeared. Wayne, on the radio, said calmly that the line would hold for an hour, maybe an hour and a half. At noon, Arlen climbed the watchtower. The wind blew in his face, carrying the smell of smoke and a sweetish scent he remembered from the northern tunnels. Below, behind the ridge, stood the swarm. 15,000 people and 15,000 beasts, and a silence hung over the swarm, the kind that comes only before the word everyone is waiting for. Arlen dropped to one knee beside the dog, just as he had a year ago on that frozen square. Only now, it wasn't the dog clinging to him. Now everything depended on the two of them. He cupped Rast's head in his palm, looked into his amber eyes, and asked if the pack was ready. Rast licked his nose. That was the entire war council. Arlen stood up, placed his hand on the amplifier's ring, and opened the channel. The world once again became veins of light, but now the veins did not end at the mountain's walls. He could feel every pair down below as clearly as a finger on his own hand. An old woman with a gray dog, a boy with a fawn, Durema with an otter, 15,000 sparks of love torn from the white murk, and furious at that murk to the point of ringing. And through all the lights, like a ridge, ran the channel connecting them to Rast. Arlen didn't give orders. A leader doesn't give orders. A leader points to the goal and takes the first step. He showed the pack the wave just as his dog saw it, not as a horror, but as prey. A huge, sick creature that had come to devour their people, and the pack responded. 15,000 channels merged into one, and from that single channel, steam rose from Arlen's wet jacket up on the tower. The Guardian, in distress, announced over the comm that the secondary circuit was locked in, that the ridge was now emitting a signal like a small nest. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the wave crashed against the line with its entire body, and at the same moment, the swarm struck. It was neither a volley nor an attack. Along the wave's front, it was as if an invisible comb had been drawn. Where the swarm's force touched the mass lost its unity. The fused bodies remembered that they had once been separate. Pieces of the wave broke away from the front and fell, dying one by one, because this flesh could not survive on its own. The wave howled. For the first time all day, its roar broke into dissonance. It was old and remembered this weapon. 800 years ago, it had been met in the same way. It changed its behavior instantly. The front spread out like pincers, enveloping the ridge from the flanks, and the main wave of the mass reared up in a hump higher than the tower and rolled toward the center, toward the swarm, at the leader. The wave, too, knew how to find what it needed. It needed the ridge of the enemy channel. Then time itself tore apart. The batteries fired point blank at the hump. The flank nets fell under the onslaught. Wayne bellowed over the radio, pulling the crews back. The swarm held the channel, and Arlen could feel the first lights flickering out at the edges of the swarm, each one that went out striking him in the ribs. The hump of the mass crawled to the foot of the cliff and began to climb. 300 meters of the swarm remained before the tower, 200. And then, clear and calm, the dog's thought rang out over the channel. It's time. Arlen requested the mountain. The Guardian replied that the salvo was ready, and that the targeting window would be brief. The wave's mass had gathered a third of the entire front's strength. There would never be a better target. Arlen embraced the dog. The pack below sensed what was about to happen and did something no one had taught them. 15,000 pairs surrendered their channel to the leader. All of it. Every last bit. Just as a pack drives a beast into the hunter's line of fire. The mountain fired. A pillar of amber fire rose from the mountain summit and arced across 5 kilometers of sky, and Arlen and Rust accepted it into their channel and guided it. They were the channel for the second time in their lives, but now it was not a spark of awakening flowing through them, but a river capable of melting stone. And 15,000 connections held them from within, so that the channel would not burn out. Arlen guided the fire down the ridge from top to bottom, tearing it open like a belly, then along the left claw, then the right. The light scorched the mass mass down to bare, molten earth, and the wave screamed across its entire front so that children wept in the tent cities beyond the mountain. The barrage lasted 90 seconds. When the pillar of fire fell back into place, the ridge, a glassy, smoking valley, lay there. The flanks of the wave receded from the ridge and retreated eastward, merging into strands. The wave had not been defeated. Of the 200 kilometers of the front, barely 30 had been burned, but it was retreating. For the first time in 800 years, it was retreating. Arlen stood on the tower, half blind, with blood streaming from his nose and ears, holding on to the dog so he wouldn't fall, while the dog clung to the deck with its paws to keep him steady. Below, the swarm was silent. Then a single person screamed, and a second later, the entire ridge was screaming. And the keeper spoke into the general communication channel, saying exactly what caused the screams to die down. He said he was recording the behavior of the mass. The wave does not retreat into the wasteland. The wave pulls back and reorganizes. It gathers the entire front, all 170 kilometers, into a single body. The wave had done this only once, 800 years ago, before the final assault on the last nest. The wave gathered for 3 days, and for 3 days the mountain gazed eastward. There, on the horizon, a shadow was growing. The mass drew in tongues and strands from across the entire front, and rose above the plain as a single body as tall as the mountain itself. The keeper calculated its volume and stopped saying the number out loud. The storage unit was empty. 11 months remained until the next salvo. The life energy batteries could burn the edges, but not a body of that size. The swarm could split up, but after the ridge, the swarm had only 14,300 pairs left, and against a single body, the arithmetic didn't add up again. The mountain council met continuously, and, going around in circles, kept coming back to the same word: conservation. Close the hatches and pray that the creature wouldn't gnaw through the mountain in a month before the air inside ran out. Arlen sat silently at these meetings and watched the dog. And Rust had been acting strangely for the 3rd day in a row. He wasn't pacing or howling. He was sleeping, deeply, as one sleeps before a long journey. And at the end of the 3rd day, he woke up, stood in the middle of the council hall, and looked at his master with a gaze that Arlen knew better than his own reflection. The gaze of discovery. Arlen stood up after him and asked aloud what we would need tomorrow. The dog walked over to the transparent wall with the map and placed his paws at the very bottom, on the outline of the mountain itself, to a point deeper than the machine room, where the veins disappeared into unmarked darkness. The keeper was silent for a long time. Then he said quietly that there was a root level beneath the nest, that access to it was sealed by the founder's seal, and that he himself did not know what was there because he had been assembled after the root had been laid. The archive holds a single line: the root awakens only for a couple of hours, when the nest has nothing to lose. The 3 of us descended, Arlen, Rast, and Ina, who said she had no intention of letting them go alone into the unknown a 3rd time. The veins led them down for 2 hours through the warmth of the earth, and the founder's seal turned out to be not a door, but a hall, round, empty. In the center, a second crystal rose from the floor. The keeper's brother, but not gray, rather a deep amber color, and warm to the eye, like a window in a house at dusk. Rast approached and lay down before it, and the crystal lit up of its own accord, without any request. The voice that arose in their minds was unlike the keeper's. It was alive, tired, kind. It said it had been waiting for 812 years, that it was not a machine, that the ones who had gone to sleep had gathered into this crystal the most precious thing they possessed. Not knowledge. Knowledge was kept by the eldest brother. Here they had stored their bonds. 80,000 pairs of the ancients, before their deaths, had surrendered their channels entirely to the root. All the love of all the people and all the beasts of the nest across all generations. The ancients knew that the wave would return, and they knew that their descendants would have neither walls nor fire enough. The wave gnaws at the walls, and the fire consumes them. The only thing the wave cannot consume is separateness. the personal, unique connection between one being and another. From this, the ancients forged their final weapon and left it in the root to await the pair who would be able to raise it. The voice said honestly that raising the root meant channeling 80,000 bonds through a single living conduit, and that the ancients would have built this conduit with the entire nest to accomplish it. He asked them if they were ready, and Arlen heard the dog breathing evenly and calmly nearby, and realized that they'd had the same answer between the two of them for a year now. Up above, meanwhile, morning had come on the final day. A single, unified wave moved toward the mountain at dawn, and the earth trembled from its advance 20 kilometers away. The mountain met it with everything it had. The batteries were pounding the front line. The swarm took up position behind the ridge and held the channel. Wayne led the civilians under the dome, and the hatches closed behind the last person. The body of the wave crept into the scorched, glassy valley, swallowed the ridge of hills, and crashed against the mountain. And at that hour, in the root chamber, Arlen placed one palm on the amber crystal and the other on the dog's collar. The root opened. It could not be called a stream, for a stream has banks. Everything flowed through the two of them. 80,000 lives lived side by side. The old man of days past dying with his hand in the mane of his lion. The girl of the past meeting her first beast. Thousands of first encounters and final goodbyes, each carrying the same indestructible fire, to be close to one's own. Arlen and Rast's channel burned and yet did not burn out, for it was made of the same fire. And all that fire they lifted upward and gave to the swarm. Outside, everyone standing on the walls saw it. The mountain flared up, not with the light of a volley, but with a steady, deep amber glow from the base to the dome, and the radiance descended from the mountain onto the plain, enveloping the swarm, and from the swarm it rolled out as a wave. The wave met it with its entire being, and for the first time in all its antiquity, it encountered something it could neither burn, nor melt, nor digest. 80,000 dead bonds and 14,000 living ones struck at it, not with force, but with difference. Every cell of the fused mass remembered that it had once been someone. The wave's body crackled along seams it did not possess. It tore apart from within into wolves, birds, and nameless creatures of ancient eras. And every creature that broke away fell onto the glassy ground and died free. The wave realized that it was dying and did one last thing. It gathered all that remained of the mass into a spear and struck, not at the walls, at the summit, at the source of the amber. And then Russ stepped forward out of the channel. Arlen felt it from within, just as one feels the step of one's own foot. The dog took the brunt of the blow. He stood in the channel between the spear and all that was alive behind him, just as he had stood a year ago as a puppy between his master and the men with carbines. And the entire route, all 80,000 connections, and the entire hundred surged through him alone, because he was the only link simple and pure enough to let such a force pass without spilling over. The white spear met the amber dog. The world went blind for a second. When sight returned to those standing on the walls, there was no wave on the plain. Hills of isolated dead bodies stretched to the very horizon, and above them, an amber glow melted in the morning light. The rumble that had been coming from the east for 40 days fell silent forever. Arlen woke up on the floor of the root hall. The crystal nearby glowed faintly and steadily, like embers at dawn. The voice of the root said quietly that the weapon of the ancients was fulfilled, and that he was empty and could now simply rest. Ina was kneeling over Rast. The dog lay on his side. The collar around his neck had grown cold and gone dark. The ring of light-colored fur beneath the collar had faded as well. Arlen crawled over and placed his hand on the dog's ribs, and the world narrowed down to a single question. The ribs rose. They fell. They rose again. Rast opened his eyes. Ordinary brown dog eyes, without a trace of amber. He looked at his owner, met his gaze, and weakly, with great effort, wagged his tail. The gift had burned out. The channel had burned out. The connection remained. It didn't live in the collar, nor did it live in the ring of fur. It lived where it had always lived. From then on, time flowed like water after the ice breaks up. A year later, the mountain and the southern nest were bustling with life, and 3 abandoned nests stood in the forests, rebuilt by the coalition's hands on a work-for-a-place basis. Vren signed the Charter of Free Nests, and the first clause of the charter was the rule dictated by Arlen: an assistant is not property, an assistant is family. Halloran headed the Mountain Council and ruled it with firmness and integrity until she reached a ripe old age. Wayne trained the garrisons. Wren opened a trading post at the crossroads between the nests and, for the first time in his life, traded at a profit without a single lie, and he was immensely proud of it. Durham returned with half the northerners to the lake region, and the stilt villages were lit up with fires once more. Tessa trained as a medic under Ina. Rzhavka learned to walk, and her first word was the dog's name. As for Arlen himself, he never held a single office. He lived in a house by the eastern gate and ran a school, a strange school, to which children were brought from all the nests. Children whose helpers seemed useless, weak beasts, ridiculous beasts. Beasts without combat ratings. Arlen taught the children one thing: to view their beast not as a tool, but as a companion. And time and again, right before his eyes, these seemingly useless helpers discovered gifts within themselves that no allocation crystal had ever recognized. Because a gift grows not from strength, but from connection. Rast lived at the school. He grew old. His muzzle turned gray. His sense of smell remained that of an Eth, and he used it shamelessly to steal sandwiches from the students. In the evenings, Arlen and the old dog would go to the eastern wall and sit there, looking out at the green plain where glass had once lain, and where the northerners now grazed their livestock. One evening, a boy from the new arrivals plucked up the courage to ask Arlen if it was true that his dog had once been able to see the future. Arlen scratched the dog behind the ear and replied that it wasn't true. The dog had never seen the future. The dog found what those she loved needed. It was just that she loved so many people. Rust opened one eye, looked at his owner, and fell asleep again. Down below, against the wall, the windows of the mountain were lighting up. Thousands of windows. And behind each one was someone who belonged to someone else.